Chapter 9. Tell us, ye dead, will none of you in pity to those you left behind disclose the secret? Oh, that some courteous ghost would blab it out, what it is you are, and we must shortly be. I've heard that souls departed have sometimes forewarned men of their deaths. It was kindly done to knock and give the alarum. Blair, Ambrosio shuddered at himself when he reflected on his rapid advances in iniquity. The enormous crime which he had just committed filled him with real horror. The murdered Elvira was continually before his eyes, and his guilt was already punished by the agonies of his conscience. Time, however, considerably weakened these impressions. One day passed away, another followed it, and still not the least suspicion was thrown upon him. Impunity reconciled him to his guilt. He began to resume his spirits, and as his fears of detection died away, he paid less attention to the reproaches of remorse. Matilda exerted herself to quiet his alarms. At the first intelligence of Elvira's death, she seemed greatly affected, and joined the monk in deploring the unhappy catastrophe of his adventure. But when she found his agitation to be somewhat calmed, and himself better disposed to listen to her arguments, she proceeded to mention his offense in milder terms, and convince him that he was not so highly culpable as he appeared to consider himself. She represented that he had only availed himself of the rights which nature allows to every one, those of self-preservation, that either Elvira or himself must have perished, and that her inflexibility and resolution to ruin him had deservedly marked her out for the victim. She next stated that as he had before rendered himself suspected to Elvira, it was a fortunate event for him that her lips were closed by death, since without this last adventure her suspicions, if made public, may have produced very disagreeable consequences. He had therefore freed himself from an enemy to whom the errors of his conduct were sufficiently known to make her dangerous, and who was the greatest obstacle to his designs upon Antonia. Those designs she encouraged him not to abandon. She assured him that, no longer protected by her mother's watchful eye, the daughter would fall an easy conquest, and by praising and enumerating Antonia's charms, she strove to rekindle the desires of the monk. In this endeavor she succeeded but too well, as if the crimes into which his passion had seduced him had only increased its violence. He longed more eagerly than ever to enjoy Antonia. The same success in concealing his present guilt, he trusted, would attend his future. He was deaf to the murmurs of conscience, and resolved to satisfy his desires at any price. He waited only for an opportunity of repeating his former enterprise, but to procure that opportunity by the same means was now impracticable. In the first transports of despair he had dashed the enchanted myrtle into 1,000 pieces. Matilda told him plainly that he must expect no further assistance from the infernal powers unless he was willing to subscribe to their established conditions. This Ambrosio was determined not to do. He persuaded himself that however great may be his iniquity, so long as he preserved his claim to salvation, he need not despair of pardon. He therefore resolutely refused to enter into any bond or compact with the fiends, and Matilda, finding him obstinate upon this point, forbore to press him further. She exerted her invention to discover some means of putting Antonia into the abbot's power, nor was it long before that means presented itself. While her ruin was thus meditating, the unhappy girl herself suffered severely from the loss of her mother. Every morning on waking, it was her first care to hasten to Elvira's chamber. On that which followed Ambrosio's fatal visit, she woke later than was her usual custom. Of this she was convinced by the abbey chimes. She started from her bed, threw on a few loose garments hastily, and was speeding to inquire how her mother had passed the night, when her foot struck against something which lay in her passage. She looked down. What was her horror at recognizing Elvira's livid corpse! She uttered a loud shriek, and threw herself upon the floor. She clasped the inanimate form to her bosom, felt that it was dead gold, and with a movement of disgust, of which she was not the mistress, let it fall again from her arms. The cry had alarmed Flora, who hastened to her assistance. The sight which she beheld penetrated her with horror, but her alarm was more audible than Antonia's. She made the house ring with her lamentations, while her mistress, almost suffocated with grief, could only mark her distress by sobs and groans. Flora's shrieks soon reached the ears of the hostess, whose terror and surprise were excessive on learning the cause of this disturbance. A physician was immediately sent for, but on the first moment of beholding the corpse, he declared that Elvira's recovery was beyond the power of our. He proceeded therefore to give his assistance to Antonia, who by this time was truly in need of it. She was conveyed to bed, while the landlady busied herself in giving orders for Elvira's burial. Dame Jacintha was a plain good kind of woman, charitable, generous, and devout, but her intellects were weak, and she was a miserable slave to fear and superstition. She shuddered at the idea of passing the night in the same house with a dead body. She was persuaded that Elvira's ghost would appear to her, and no less certain that such a visit would kill her with fright. From this persuasion, she resolved to pass the night at a neighbor's and insisted that the funeral should take place the next day. St. Clare's cemetery being the nearest, it was determined that Elvira should be buried there. Dame Jacintha engaged to defray every expense attending the burial. She knew not in what circumstances Antonia was left, but from the sparing manner in which the family had lived, she concluded them to be indifferent. Consequently, she entertained very little hope of ever being recompensed, but this consideration prevented her not from taking care that the interment was performed with decency, and from showing the unfortunate Antonia all possible respect. Nobody dies of mere grief. Of this Antonia was an instance. Aided by her youth and healthy constitution, she shook off the malady which her mother's death had occasioned, but it was not so easy to remove the disease of her mind. Her eyes were constantly filled with tears. Every trifle affected her, and she evidently nourished in her bosom a profound and rooted melancholy. The slightest mention of Elvira, the most trivial circumstance recalling that beloved parent to her memory, was sufficient to throw her into serious agitation. How much would her grief have been increased had she known the agonies which terminated her mother's existence? But of this no one entertained the least suspicion. Elvira was subject to strong convulsions. It was supposed that, aware of their approach, she had dragged herself to her daughter's chamber in hopes of assistance, that a sudden access of her fits had seized her, too violent to be resisted by her already enfeebled state of health, and that she had expired before she had time to reach the medicine which generally relieved her, and which stood upon a shelf in Antonia's room. This idea was firmly credited by the few people who interested themselves about Elvira. Her death was esteemed a natural event, and soon forgotten by all save by her, who had but too much reason to deplore her loss. In truth, Antonia's situation was sufficiently embarrassing and unpleasant. She was alone in the amid of a dissipated and expensive city. She was ill provided with money, and worse with friends. Her aunt Leonela was still at Cordova, and she knew not her direction. Of the Marquis de las Cisternas she heard no news. As to Lorenzo, she had long given up the idea of possessing any interest in his bosom. She knew not to whom she could address herself in her present dilemma. She wished to consult Ambrosio, but she remembered her mother's injunctions to shun him as much as possible, and the last conversation which Elvira had held with her upon the subject had given her sufficient lights respecting his designs to put her upon her guard against him in future. Still all her mother's warnings could not make her change her good opinion of the friar. She continued to feel that his friendship and society were requisite to her happiness. She looked upon his failings with a partial eye, and could not persuade herself that he really had intended her ruin. However, Elvira had positively commanded her to drop his acquaintance, and she had too much respect for her orders to disobey them. At length she resolved to address herself for advice and protection to the Marquis de las Cisternas, as being her nearest relation. She wrote to him, briefly stating her desolate situation. She besought him to compassionate his brother's child, to continue to her Elvira's pension, and to authorize her retiring to his old castle in Mercia, which till now had been her retreat. Having sealed her letter, she gave it to the trusty Flora, who immediately set out to execute her commission. But Antonia was born under an unlucky star. Had she made her application to the Marquis but one day sooner, received as his niece and placed at the head of his family, she would have escaped all the misfortunes with which she was now threatened. Raymond had always intended to execute this plan, but first, his hopes of making the proposal to Elvira through the lips of Agnes, and afterwards, his disappointment at losing his intended bride, as well as the severe illness which for some time had confined him to his bed, made him defer from day to day the giving an asylum in his house to his brother's widow. He had commissioned Lorenzo to supply her liberally with money, but Elvira, unwilling to receive obligations from that nobleman, had assured him that she needed no immediate pecuniary assistance. Consequently, the Marquis did not imagine that a trifling delay on his part could create any embarrassment, and the distress and agitation of his mind may well excuse his negligence. Had he been informed that Elvira's death had left her daughter friendless and unprotected, he would doubtless have taken such measures as would have ensured her from every danger. But Antonia was not destined to be so fortunate. The day on which she sent her letter to the Palace de las Cisternas was that following Lorenzo's departure from Madrid. The Marquis was in the first paroxysms of despair at the conviction that Agnes was truly no more. He was delirious, and his life being in danger, no one was suffered to approach him. Flora was informed that he was incapable of attending to letters, and that probably a few hours would decide his fate. With this unsatisfactory answer, she was obliged to return to her mistress, who now found herself plunged into greater difficulties than ever. Flora and Dame Jacintha exerted themselves to console her. The latter begged her to make herself easy, for that as long as she chose to stay with her, she would treat her like her own child. Antonia, finding that the good woman had taken a real affection for her, was somewhat comforted by thinking that she had at least one friend in the world. A letter was now brought to her, directed to Elvira. She recognized Leonella's writing, and opening it with joy, found a detailed account of her aunt's adventures at Cordova. She informed her sister that she had recovered her legacy, had lost her heart, and had received in exchange that of the most amiable of apothecaries, past, present, and to come. She added that she should be at Madrid on the Tuesday night, and meant to have the pleasure of presenting her caro sposo in form. Though her nuptials were far from pleasing Antonia, Leonella's speedy return gave her niece much delight. She rejoiced in thinking that she should once more be under a relation's care. She could not but judge it to be highly improper for a young woman to be living among absolute strangers, with no one to regulate her conduct or protect her from the insults to which, in her defenseless situation, she was exposed. She therefore looked forward with impatience to the Tuesday night. It arrived. Antonia listened anxiously to the carriages as they rolled along the street. None of them stopped, and it grew late without Leonella's appearing. Still, Antonia resolved to sit up till her aunt's arrival, and in spite of all her remonstrances, Dame Jacintha and Flora insisted upon doing the same. The hours passed on slow and tediously. Lorenzo's departure from Madrid had put a stop to the nightly serenades. She hoped in vain to hear the usual sound of guitars beneath her window. She took up her own and struck a few chords, but music that evening had lost its charms for her, and she soon replaced the instrument in its case. She seated herself at her embroidery frame, but nothing went right. The silks were missing, the thread snapped every moment, and the needles were so expert at falling that they seemed to be animated. At length a flake of wax fell from the taper, which stood near her upon a favorite wreath of violets. This completely discomposed her. She threw down her needle and quitted the frame. It was decreed that for that night nothing should have the power of amusing her. She was the prey of ennui, and employed herself in making fruitless wishes for the arrival of her aunt. As she walked with a listless air up and down the chamber, the door caught her eye conducting to that which had been her mother's. She remembered that Elvira's little library was arranged there, and thought that she may possibly find in it some book to amuse her till Leonella should arrive. Accordingly, she took her taper from the table, passed through the little closet, and entered the adjoining apartment. As she looked around her, the sight of this room brought to her recollection 1,000 painful ideas. It was the first time of her entering it since her mother's death. The total silence prevailing through the chamber, the bed despoiled of its furniture, the cheerless hearth where stood an extinguished lamp, and a few dying plants in the window which, since Elvira's loss, had been neglected, inspired Antonia with a melancholy awe. The gloom of night gave strength to this sensation. She placed her light upon the table and sank into a large chair, in which she had seen her mother seated 1,000 times. She was never to see her seated there again. Tears unbidden streamed down her cheek, and she abandoned herself to the sadness, which grew deeper with every moment. Ashamed of her weakness, she at length rose from her seat. She proceeded to seek for what had brought her to this melancholy scene. The small collection of books was arranged upon several shelves in order. Antonia examined them without finding anything likely to interest her, till she put her hand upon a volume of old Spanish ballads. She read a few stanzas of one of them. They excited her curiosity. She took down the book and seated herself to peruse it with more ease. She trimmed the taper, which now drew towards its end, and then read the following ballad. Alonso the brave and fair Imogen, a warrior so bold and a virgin so bright, conversed as they sat on the green. They gazed on each other with tender delight. Alonso the brave was the name of the knight, the maid's was the fair Imogen. And oh, said the youth, since to-morrow I go to fight in a far distant land, your tears for my absence soon leaving to flow, some other will court you, and you will bestow on a wealthier suitor your hand. Oh, hush these suspicions, fair Imogen said, offensive to love and to me, for if ye be living, or if ye be dead, I swear by the Virgin, that none in your stead shall husband of Imogen be. If e'er I by lust or by wealth led aside, forget my Alonso the brave, God grant that to punish my falsehood and pride, your ghost at the marriage may sit by my side, may tax me with perjury, claim me as bride, and bear me away to the grave. To Palestine hastened the hero so bold. His love, she lamented him sore, but scarce had a 12-month elapsed, when behold, a baron all covered with jewels and gold, arrived at fair Imogen's door. His treasure, his presents, his spacious domain, soon made her untrue to her vows. He dazzled her eyes, he bewildered her brain, he caught her affections so light and so vain, and carried her home as his spouse. And now had the marriage been blessed by the priest, the revelry now was begun. The tables, they groaned with the weight of the feast, nor yet had the laughter and merriment ceased, when the bell of the castle tolled. One. Then first with amazement fair Imogen found that a stranger was placed by her side. His air was terrific. He uttered no sound, he spoke not, he moved not, he looked not around, but earnestly gazed on the bride. His visor was closed, and gigantic his height. His armor was sable to view. All pleasure and laughter were hushed at his sight. The dogs, as they eyed him, drew back in affright. The lights in the chamber burned blue. His presence all bosoms appeared to dismay. The guests sat in silence and fear. At length spoke the bride, while she trembled. I pray, Sir Knight, that your helmet aside you would lay, and deign to partake of our cheer. The lady is silent, the stranger complies. His visor lies slowly unclosed. Oh, God! What a sight met fair Imogen's eyes! What words can express her dismay and surprise, when a skeleton's head was exposed? All present then uttered a terrified shout. All turned with disgust from the scene. The worms, they crept in, and the worms, they crept out, and sported his eyes and his temples about, while the spectre addressed Imogen. Behold me, you false one, behold me, he cried. Remember Alonso the brave. God grants that to punish your falsehood and pride, my ghost at your marriage should sit by your side, should tax you with perjury, claim you as bride, and bear you away to the grave. Thus saying, his arms round the lady he wound, while loudly she shrieked in dismay, then sank with his prey through the wide yawning ground. Nor ever again was fair Imogen found, or the spectre who bore her away. Not long lived the baron, and none since that time to inhabit the castle presume, for chronicles tell that by order sublime there Imogen suffers the pain of her crime, and mourns her deplorable doom. At midnight 4 times in each year does her sprite, when mortals in slumber are bound, arrayed in her bridal apparel of white, appear in the hall with a skeleton knight, and shriek as he whirls her around. While they drink out of skulls newly torn from the grave, dancing round them the spectres are seen. Their liquor is blood and this horrible stave. They howl to the health of Alonso the Brave, and his consort, the false Imogen. The perusal of this story was ill calculated to dispel Antonia's melancholy. She had naturally a strong inclination to the marvelous, and her nurse, who believed firmly in apparitions, had related to her when an infant so many horrible adventures of this kind, that all Elvira's attempts had failed to eradicate their impressions from her daughter's mind. Antonia still nourished a superstitious prejudice in her bosom. She was often susceptible of terrors which, when she discovered their natural and insignificant cause, made her blush at her own weakness. With such a turn of mind, the adventure which she had just been reading sufficed to give her apprehensions the alarm. The hour and the scene combined to authorize them. It was the dead of night. She was alone, and in the chamber once occupied by her deceased mother. The weather was comfortless and stormy, the wind howled around the house, the doors rattled in their frames, and the heavy rain pattered against the windows. No other sound was heard. The taper, now burnt down to the socket, sometimes flaring upwards shot a gleam of light through the room, then sinking again seemed upon the point of expiring. Antonia's heart throbbed with agitation. Her eyes wandered fearfully over the objects around her, as the trembling flame illuminated them at intervals. She attempted to rise from her seat, but her limbs trembled so violently that she was unable to proceed. She then called Flora, who was in a room at no great distance, but agitation choked her voice, and her cries died away in hollow murmurs. She passed some minutes in this situation, after which her terrors began to diminish. She strove to recover herself, and acquire strength enough to quit the room. Suddenly she fancied that she heard a low sigh drawn near her. This idea brought back her former weakness. She had already raised herself from her seat, and was on the point of taking the lamp from the table. The imaginary noise stopped her. She drew back her hand, and supported herself upon the back of a chair. She listened anxiously, but nothing more was heard. Gracious God, she said to herself, what could be that sound? Was I deceived, or did I really hear it? Her reflections were interrupted by a noise at the door scarcely audible. It seemed as if somebody was whispering. Antonia's alarm increased. Yet the bolt she knew to be fastened, and this idea in some degree reassured her. Soon the latch was lifted up softly, and the door moved with caution backwards and forwards. Excess of terror now supplied Antonia with that strength of which she had till then been deprived. She started from her place and made towards the closet door, from where she may soon have reached the chamber where she expected to find Flora and Dame Jacintha. Scarcely had she reached the middle of the room when the latch was lifted up a second time. An involuntary movement obliged her to turn her head. Slowly and gradually the door turned upon its hinges, and standing upon the threshold she beheld a tall thin figure, wrapped in a white shroud which covered it from head to foot. This vision arrested her feet. She remained as if petrified in the middle of the apartment. The stranger with measured and solemn steps drew near the table. The dying taper darted a blue and melancholy flame as the figure advanced towards it. Over the table was fixed a small clock. The hand of it was upon the stroke of 3. The figure stopped opposite to the clock. It raised its right arm and pointed to the hour, at the same time looking earnestly upon Antonia, who waited for the conclusion of this scene, motionless and silent. The figure remained in this posture for some moments. The clock struck. When the sound had ceased, the stranger advanced yet a few steps nearer Antonia. Yet 3 days, said a voice faint, hollow, and sepulchral. Yet 3 days, and we meet again. Antonia shuddered at the words. We meet again, she pronounced at length with difficulty. Where shall we meet? Whom shall I meet? The figure pointed to the ground with one hand, and with the other raised the linen which covered its face. Almighty God, my mother! Antonia shrieked, and fell lifeless upon the floor. Dame Jacintha, who was at work in a neighboring chamber, was alarmed by the cry. Flora was just gone downstairs to fetch fresh oil for the lamp, by which they had been sitting. Jacintha therefore hastened alone to Antonia's assistance, and great was her amazement to find her extended upon the floor. She raised her in her arms, conveyed her to her apartment, and placed her upon the bed still senseless. She then proceeded to bathe her temples, chafe her hands, and use all possible means of bringing her to herself. With some difficulty she succeeded. Antonia opened her eyes and looked round her wildly. "Where is she?" she cried in a trembling voice. "Is she gone? Am I safe? Speak to me, comfort me. Oh, speak to me for God's sake." "Safe from whom, my child?" replied the astonished Jacintha. "What alarms you? Of whom are you afraid?" "In 3 days. She told me that we should meet in 3 days. I heard her say it. I saw her. Jacintha, I saw her but this moment." She threw herself upon Jacintha's bosom. "You saw her? Saw whom?" "My mother's ghost. Christ Jesus," cried Jacintha, and starting from the bed, let fall Antonia upon the pillow, and fled in consternation out of the room. As she hastened downstairs, she met Flora sending them. "Go to your mistress, Flora," said she. "Here are rare doings. Oh, I am the most unfortunate woman alive. My house is filled with ghosts and dead bodies, and the Lord knows what besides. Yet I am sure nobody likes such company less than I do. But go your way to Donna Antonia, Flora, and let me go mine." Thus saying, she continued her course to the street door, which she opened, and without allowing herself time to throw on her veil, she made the best of her way to the Capuchin Abbey. In the meanwhile, Flora hastened to her lady's chamber, equally surprised and alarmed at Jacintha's consternation. She found Antonia lying upon the bed insensible. She used the same means for her recovery that Jacintha had already employed, but finding that her mistress only recovered from one fit to fall into another, she sent in all haste for a physician. While expecting his arrival, she undressed Antonia and conveyed her to bed. Heedless of the storm, terrified almost out of her senses, Jacintha ran through the streets and stopped not till she reached the gate of the abbey. She rang loudly at the bell, and as soon as the porter appeared, she desired permission to speak to the superior. Ambrosio was then conferring with Matilda upon the means of procuring access to Antonia. The cause of Elvira's death remaining unknown, he was convinced that crimes were not so swiftly followed by punishment as his instructors the monks had taught him, and as till then he had himself believed. This persuasion made him resolve upon Antonia's ruin, for the enjoyment of whose person dangers and difficulties only seemed to have increased his passion. The monk had already made one attempt to gain admission to her presence, but Flora had refused him in such a manner as to convince him that all future endeavors must be vain. Elvira had confided her suspicions to that trusty servant. She had desired her never to leave Ambrosio alone with her daughter, and if possible to prevent their meeting altogether. Flora promised to obey her, and had executed her orders to the very letter. Ambrosio's visit had been rejected that morning, though Antonia was ignorant of it. He saw that to obtain a sight of his mistress by open means was out of the question, and both himself and Matilda had consumed the night in endeavoring to invent some plan whose event may be more successful. Such was their employment, when a lay brother entered the abbot's cell, and informed him that a woman calling herself Jacintha's eunucher requested audience for a few minutes. Ambrosio was by no means disposed to grant the petition of his visitor. He refused it positively, and bade the lay brother tell the stranger to return the next day. Matilda interrupted him. "See this woman," said she in a low voice. "I have my reasons." The abbot obeyed her, and signified that he would go to the parlor immediately. With this answer the lay brother withdrew. As soon as they were alone, Ambrosio inquired why Matilda wished him to see this Jacintha. "She is Antonia's hostess," replied Matilda. "She may possibly be of use to you, but let us examine her, and learn what brings her here." They proceeded together to the parlor, where Jacintha was already waiting for the abbot. She had conceived a great opinion of his piety and virtue, and supposing him to have much influence over the devil, thought that it must be an easy matter for him to lay Elvira's ghost in the Red Sea. Filled with this persuasion, she had hastened to the abbey. As soon as she saw the monk enter the parlor, she dropped upon her knees and began her story as follows. "Oh, Reverend Father, such an accident, such an adventure! I know not what course to take, and unless you can help me, I shall certainly go distracted. Well, to be sure, never was woman so unfortunate as myself. All in my power to keep clear of such abomination have I done, and yet, that all is too little. What signifies my telling my beads 4 times a day, and observing every fast prescribed by the calendar? What signifies my having made 3 pilgrimages to St. James of Compostela, and purchased as many pardons from the Pope as would buy off Cain's punishment? Nothing prospers with me, all goes wrong, and God only knows whether anything will ever go right again. Why now, be your holiness the judge. My lodger dies in convulsions. Out of pure kindness I bury her at my own expense, not that she is any relation of mine, or that I shall be benefited a single pistole by her death. I got nothing by it, and therefore you know, Reverend Father, that her living or dying was just the same to me. But that is nothing to the purpose. To return to what I was saying, I took care of her funeral, had everything performed decently and properly, and put myself to expense enough, God knows. And how do you think the lady repays me for my kindness? Why, truly by refusing to sleep quietly in her comfortable deal coffin, as a peaceable, well-disposed spirit ought to do, and coming to plague me, who never wish to set eyes on her again. Forsooth, it well becomes her to go racketing about my house at midnight, popping into her daughter's room through the keyhole, and frightening the poor child out of her wits. Though she be a ghost, she may be more civil than to bolt into a person's house, who likes her company so little. But as for me, Reverend Father, the plain state of the case is this. If she walks into my house, I must walk out of it, for I cannot abide such visitors, not I. Thus you see, your sanctity, that without your assistance I am ruined and undone forever. I shall be obliged to quit my house. Nobody will take it, when it is known that she haunts it, and then I shall find myself in a fine situation. Miserable woman that I am! What shall I do? What will become of me?" Here she wept bitterly, wrung her hands, and begged to know the abbot's opinion of her case. "In truth, good woman," replied he, "it will be difficult for me to relieve you without knowing what is the matter with you. You have forgotten to tell me what has happened, and what it is you want." "Let me die," cried Jacintha, "but your sanctity is in the right. This then is the fact stated briefly. A lodger of mine is lately dead, a very good sort of woman that I must needs say for her as far as my knowledge of her went, though that was not a great way. She kept me too much at a distance, for truly she was given to be upon the high ropes, and whenever I ventured to speak to her, she had a look with her which always made me feel a little queerish. God forgive me for saying so. However, though she was more stately than needful, and affected to look down upon me, though if I am well informed, I come of as good parents as she could do for her ears, for her father was a shoemaker at Cordova, and mine was an hatter at Madrid, ay, and a very creditable hatter too, let me tell you. Yet for all her pride, she was a quiet well-behaved body, and I never wished to have a better lodger. This makes me wonder the more at her not sleeping quietly in her grave. But there is no trusting to people in this world. For my part, I never saw her do amiss, except on the Friday before her death. To be sure, I was then much scandalized by seeing her eat the wing of a chicken. "How, Madonna Flora," quoth I. "Flora, may it please your reverence, is the name of the waiting maid. How, Madonna Flora," quoth I, "does your mistress eat flesh upon Fridays?" "Well, well, see the event, and then remember that Dame Jacintha warned you of it." These were my very words, but alas, I may as well have held my tongue. Nobody minded me, and Flora, who is somewhat pert and snappish, more is the pity, say I told me that there was no more harm in eating a chicken than the egg from which it came. No, she evening declared that if her lady added a slice of bacon, she would not be an inch nearer damnation. God protect us. A poor, ignorant, sinful soul, I protest to your holiness. I trembled to hear her utter such blasphemies, and expected every moment to see the ground open and swallow her up, chicken and all. For you must know, worshipful Father, that while she talked thus, she held the plate in her hand, on which lay the identical roast fowl, and a fine bird it was, that I must say for it, done to a turn, for I superintended the cooking of it myself. It was a little Galician of my own raising, may it please your holiness, and the flesh was as white as an eggshell, as truly Donna Elvira told me herself. Dame Jacintha, said she, very good-humoredly, though to say the truth, she was always very polite to me. Here Ambrosio's patience failed him. Eager to know Jacintha's business in which Antonia seemed to be concerned, he was almost distracted while listening to the rambling of this prosing old woman. He interrupted her, and protested that if she did not immediately tell her story and have done with it, he should quit the parlor, and leave her to get out of her difficulties by herself. This threat had the desired effect. Jacintha related her business in as few words as she could manage, but her account was still so prolix that Ambrosio had need of his patience to bear him to the conclusion. And so, your reverence, said she, after relating Elvira's death and burial, with all their circumstances, and so, your reverence, upon hearing the shriek, I put away my work, and away posted I to Donna Antonia's chamber. Finding nobody there, I passed on to the next, but I must own, I was a little timorous at going in, for this was the very room where Donna Elvira used to sleep. However, in I went, and sure enough, there lay the young lady at full length upon the floor, as cold as a stone, and as white as a sheet. I was surprised at this, as your holiness may well suppose, but oh me, how I shook, when I saw a great tall figure at my elbow whose head touched the ceiling. The face was Donna Elvira's, I must confess, but out of its mouth came clouds of fire. Its arms were loaded with heavy chains which it rattled piteously, and every hair on its head was a serpent as big as my arm. At this I was frightened enough, and began to say my Ave Maria. But the ghost interrupting me uttered 3 loud groans, and roared out in a terrible voice, "Oh, that chicken's wing! My poor soul suffers for it." As soon as she had said this, the ground opened, the spectre sank down, I heard a clap of thunder, and the room was filled with a smell of brimstone. When I recovered from my fright, and had brought Donna Antonia to herself, who told me that she had cried out upon seeing her mother's ghost, and well may she cry, poor soul, had I been in her place, I should have cried 10 times louder. It directly came into my head that if any one had power to quiet this spectre, it must be your reverence. So here I came in all diligence, to beg that you will sprinkle my house with holy water, and lay the apparition in the Red Sea. Ambrosio stared at this strange story, which he could not credit. Did Donna Antonia also see the ghost? Said he, as plain as I see you, reverend father. Ambrosio paused for a moment. Here was an opportunity offered him of gaining access to Antonia, but he hesitated to employ it. The reputation which he enjoyed in Madrid was still dear to him, and since he had lost the reality of virtue, it appeared as if its semblance was become more valuable. He was conscious that publicly to break through the rule never to quit the abbey precincts would derogate much from his supposed austerity. In visiting Elvira, he had always taken care to keep his features concealed from the domestics. Except by the lady, her daughter, and the faithful Flora, he was known in the family by no other name than that of Father Jerome. Should he comply with Jacintha's request, and accompany her to her house, he knew that the violation of his rule could not be kept a secret. However, his eagerness to see Antonia obtained the victory. He evening hoped that the singularity of this adventure would justify him in the eyes of Madrid. But whatever may be the consequences, he resolved to profit by the opportunity which chance had presented to him. An expressive look from Matilda confirmed him in this resolution. "Good woman," said he to Jacintha, "what you tell me is so extraordinary that I can scarcely credit your assertions. However, I will comply with your request. Tomorrow after matins you may expect me at your house. I will then examine into what I can do for you, and if it is in my power, will free you from this unwelcome visitor. Now then go home, and peace be with you." "Home?" exclaimed Jacintha. I go home, not I by my troth. Except under your protection, I set no foot of mine within the threshold. God help me, the ghost may meet me upon the stairs, and whisk me away with her to the devil. Oh, that I had accepted young Melchior Basco's offer. Then I should have had somebody to protect me, but now I am a lone woman, and meet with nothing but crosses and misfortunes. Thank heaven, it is not yet too late to repent. There is Simon Gonzales will have me any day of the week, and if I live till daybreak, I will marry him out of hand, and husband I will have. That is determined, for now this ghost is once in my house, I shall be frightened out of my wits to sleep alone. But for God's sake, Reverend Father, come with me now. I shall have no rest till the house is purified, or the poor young lady either. The dear girl, she is in a piteous taking. I left her in strong convulsions, and I doubt she will not easily recover her fright. The friar started, and interrupted her hastily. In convulsions, say you? Antonia in convulsions? Lead on, good woman, I follow you this moment. Jacinta insisted upon his stopping to furnish himself with a vessel of holy water. With this request he complied, thinking herself safe under his protection should a legion of ghosts attack her. The old woman returned the monk a profusion of thanks, and they departed together for the Strada di San Iago. So strong an impression had the spectre made upon Antonia, that for the first 2 or 3 hours the physician declared her life to be in danger. The fits at length becoming less frequent induced him to alter his opinion. He said that to keep her quiet was all that was necessary, and he ordered a medicine to be prepared which would tranquilize her nerves, and procure her that repose which at present she much wanted. The sight of Ambrosio, who now appeared with Jacinta at her bedside, contributed essentially to compose her ruffled spirits. Elvira had not sufficiently explained herself upon the nature of his designs, to make a girl so ignorant of the world as her daughter aware how dangerous was his acquaintance. At this moment, when penetrated with horror at the scene which had just passed, and dreading to contemplate the ghost's prediction, her mind had need of all the succors of friendship and religion. Antonia regarded the abbot with an eye doubly partial. That strong prepossession in his favor still existed which she had felt for him at first sight. She fancied, yet knew not therefore, that his presence was a safeguard to her from every danger, insult, or misfortune. She thanked him gratefully for his visit, and related to him the adventure, which had alarmed her so seriously. The abbot strove to reassure her, and convince her that the whole had been a deception of her overheated fancy. The solitude in which she had passed the evening, the gloom of night, the book which she had been reading, and the room in which she sat, were all calculated to place before her such a vision. He treated the idea of ghosts with ridicule, and produced strong arguments to prove the fallacy of such a system. His conversation tranquilized and comforted her, but did not convince her. She could not believe that the spectre had been a mere creature of her imagination. Every circumstance was impressed upon her mind too forcibly to permit her flattering herself with such an idea. She persisted in asserting that she had really seen her mother's ghost, had heard the period of her dissolution announced, and declared that she never should quit her bed alive. Ambrosio advised her against encouraging these sentiments, and then quitted her chamber, having promised to repeat his visit on the tomorrow. Antonia received this assurance with every mark of joy, but the monk easily perceived that he was not equally acceptable to her attendant. Flora obeyed Elvira's injunctions with the most scrupulous observance. She examined every circumstance with an anxious eye likely in the least to prejudice her young mistress, to whom she had been attached for many years. She was a native of Cuba, had followed Elvira to Spain, and loved the young Antonia with a mother's affection. Flora quitted not the room for a moment while the abbot remained there. She watched his every word, his every look, his every action. He saw that her suspicious eye was always fixed upon him, and conscious that his designs would not bear inspection so minute, he felt frequently confused and disconcerted. He was aware that she doubted the purity of his intentions, that she would never leave him alone with Antonia, and his mistress defended by the presence of this vigilant observer, he despaired of finding the means to gratify his passion. As he quitted the house, Jacintha met him, and begged that some masses may be sung for the repose of Elvira's soul, which she doubted not was suffering in purgatory. He promised not to forget her request, but he perfectly gained the old woman's heart by engaging to watch during the whole of the approaching night in the haunted chamber. Jacintha could find no term sufficiently strong to express her gratitude, and the monk departed loaded with her benedictions. It was broad day when he returned to the abbey. His first care was to communicate what had passed to his confidant. He felt too sincere a passion for Antonia to have heard unmoved the prediction of her speedy death, and he shuddered at the idea of losing an object so dear to him. Upon this head Matilda reassured him. She confirmed the arguments which himself had already used. She declared Antonia to have been deceived by the wandering of her brain, by the spleen which oppressed her at the moment, and by the natural turn of her mind to superstition and the marvelous. As to Jacintha's account, the absurdity refuted itself. The abbot hesitated not to believe that she had fabricated the whole story, either confused by terror or hoping to make him comply more readily with her request. Having overruled the monk's apprehensions, Matilda continued thus: "The prediction and the ghost are equally false, but it must be your care, Ambrosio, to verify the first. Antonia within 3 days must truly be dead to the world, but she must live for you. Her present illness, and this fancy which she has taken into her head, will color a plan which I have long meditated, but which was impracticable without your procuring access to Antonia. She shall be yours, not for a single night, but for ever. All the vigilance of her duenna shall not avail her. You shall riot unrestrained in the charms of your mistress. This very day must the scheme be put in execution, for you have no time to lose. The nephew of the Duke of Medinaceli prepares to demand Antonia for his bride. In a few days she will be removed to the palace of her relation, the Marquis de las Cisternas, and there she will be secure from your attempts. Thus during your absence have I been informed by my spies, who are ever employed in bringing me intelligence for your service. Now then listen to me. There is a juice extracted from certain herbs, known but to few, which brings on the person who drinks it the exact image of death. Let this be administered to Antonia. You may easily find means to pour a few drops into her medicine. The effect will be throwing her into strong convulsions for an hour, after which her blood will gradually cease to flow and heart to beat. A mortal paleness will spread itself over her features, and she will appear a corpse to every eye. She has no friends about her. You may charge yourself unsuspected with the superintendence of her funeral, and cause her to be buried in the vaults of St. Clare. Their solitude and easy access render these caverns favorable to your designs. Give Antonia the soporific draught this evening, 8, and 40 hours after she has drank it, life will revive to her bosom. She will then be absolutely in your power. She will find all resistance unavailing, and necessity will compel her to receive you in her arms. Antonia will be in my power," exclaimed the monk. "Matilda, you transport me. At length, then, happiness will be mine, and that happiness will be Matilda's gift, will be the gift of friendship. I shall clasp Antonia in my arms, far from every prying eye, from every tormenting intruder. I shall sigh out my soul upon her bosom, shall teach her young heart the first rudiments of pleasure, and revel uncontrolled in the endless variety of her charms. And shall this delight truly be mine? Shall I give the reins to my desires, and gratify every wild, tumultuous wish? Oh, Matilda, how can I express to you my gratitude? By profiting by my counsels. Ambrosio, I live but to serve you. Your interest and happiness are equally mine. Be your person Antonia's, but to your friendship and your heart I still assert my claim. Contributing to yours forms now my only pleasure. Should my exertions procure the gratification of your wishes, I shall consider my trouble to be amply repaid. But let us lose no time. The liquor of which I spoke is only to be found in St. Clare's laboratory. Hasten then to the prioress, request of her admission to the laboratory, and it will not be denied. There is a closet at the lower end of the great room, filled with liquids of different colors and qualities. The bottle in question stands by itself upon the third shelf on the left. It contains a greenish liquor. Fill a small phial with it when you are unobserved, and Antonia is your own." The monk hesitated not to adopt this infamous plan. His desires, but too violent before, had acquired fresh vigor from the sight of Antonia. As he sat by her bedside, accident had discovered to him some of those charms which till then had been concealed from him. He found them even more perfect than his ardent imagination had pictured them. Sometimes her white and polished arm was displayed in arranging the pillow, sometimes a sudden movement discovered part of her swelling bosom. But wherever the new-found charm presented itself, there rested the friar's gloating eyes. Scarcely could he master himself sufficiently to conceal his desires from Antonia and her vigilant Duna. Inflamed by the remembrance of these beauties, he entered into Matilda's scheme without hesitation. No sooner were matins over than he bent his course towards the convent of St. Clare. His arrival threw the whole sisterhood into the utmost amazement. The prioress was sensible of the honor done her convent by his paying it his first visit, and strove to express her gratitude by every possible attention. He was paraded through the garden, shown all the relics of saints and martyrs, and treated with as much respect and distinction as had he been the Pope himself. On his part, Ambrosio received the Domina's civilities very graciously, and strove to remove her surprise at his having broken through his resolution. He stated that among his penitents, illness prevented many from quitting their houses. These were exactly the people who most needed his advice and the comforts of religion. Many representations had been made to him upon this account, and though highly repugnant to his own wishes, he had found it absolutely necessary for the service of heaven to change his determination and quit his beloved retirement. The prioress applauded his zeal in his profession and his charity towards mankind. She declared that Madrid was happy in possessing a man so perfect and irreproachable. In such discourse, the friar at length reached the laboratory. He found the closet. The bottle stood in the place which Matilda had described, and the monk seized an opportunity to fill his phial unobserved with the soporific liquor. Then, having partaken of a collation in the refectory, he retired from the convent pleased with the success of his visit, and leaving the nuns delighted by the honor conferred upon them. He waited till evening before he took the road to Antonia's dwelling. Jacintha welcomed him with transport, and besought him not to forget his promise to pass the night in the haunted chamber. That promise he now repeated. He found Antonia tolerably well, but still harping upon the ghost's prediction. Flora moved not from her lady's bed, and by symptoms yet stronger than on the former night testified her dislike to the abbot's presence. Still Ambrosio affected not to observe them. The physician arrived while he was conversing with Antonia. It was dark already, lights were called for, and Flora was compelled to descend for them herself. However, as she left a third person in the room, and expected to be absent but a few minutes, she believed that she risked nothing in quitting her post. No sooner had she left the room than Ambrosio moved towards the table on which stood Antonia's medicine. It was placed in a recess of the window. The physician, seated in an armchair and employed in questioning his patient, paid no attention to the proceedings of the monk. Ambrosio seized the opportunity. He drew out the fatal phial and let a few drops fall into the medicine. He then hastily left the table and returned to the seat which he had quitted. When Flora made her appearance with lights, everything seemed to be exactly as she had left it. The physician declared that Antonia may quit her chamber the next day with perfect safety. He recommended her following the same prescription which, on the night before, had procured her a refreshing sleep. Flora replied that the draught stood ready upon the table. He advised the patient to take it without delay, and then retired. Flora poured the medicine into a cup and presented it to her mistress. At that moment Ambrosio's courage failed him. May not Matilda have deceived him? May not jealousy have persuaded her to destroy her rival, and substitute poison in the room of an opiate? This idea appeared so reasonable that he was on the point of preventing her from swallowing the medicine. His resolution was adopted too late. The cup was already emptied, and Antonia restored it into Flora's hands. No remedy was now to be found. Ambrosio could only expect the moment impatiently, destined to decide upon Antonia's life or death, upon his own happiness or despair, dreading to create suspicion by his stay, or betray himself by his mind's agitation. He took leave of his victim and withdrew from the room. Antonia parted from him with less cordiality than on the former night. Flora had represented to her mistress that to admit his visits was to disobey her mother's orders. She described to her his emotion on entering the room, and the fire which sparkled in his eyes while he gazed upon her. This had escaped Antonia's observation, but not her attendants, who, explaining the monk's designs and their probable consequences in terms much clearer than Elvira's, though not quite so delicate, had succeeded in alarming her young lady and persuading her to treat him more distantly than she had done hitherto. The idea of obeying her mother's will at once determined Antonia. Though she grieved at losing his society, she conquered herself sufficiently to receive the monk with some degree of reserve and coldness. She thanked him with respect and gratitude for his former visits, but did not invite his repeating them in future. It now was not the friar's interest to solicit admission to her presence, and he took leave of her as if not designing to return. Fully persuaded that the acquaintance which she dreaded was now at an end, Flora was so much worked upon by his easy compliance that she began to doubt the justice of her suspicions. As she lighted him downstairs, she thanked him for having endeavored to root out from Antonia's mind her superstitious terrors of the spectre's prediction. She added that as he seemed interested in Donna Antonia's welfare, should any change take place in her situation, she would be careful to let him know it. The monk, in replying, took pains to raise his voice, hoping that Jacinta would hear it. In this he succeeded. As he reached the foot of the stairs with his conductress, the landlady failed not to make her appearance. "Why, surely you are not going away, reverend father?" cried she. "Did you not promise to pass the night in the haunted chamber? Christ Jesus, I shall be left alone with the ghost, and a fine pickle I shall be in by morning. Do all I could, say all I could, that obstinate old brute, Simon Gonzales, refused to marry me today, and before tomorrow comes, I suppose, I shall be torn to pieces by the ghosts and goblins and devils and what not. For God's sake, your holiness, do not leave me in such a woeful condition. On my bended knees I beseech you to keep your promise. Watch this night in the haunted chamber, lay the apparition in the Red Sea, and Jacintha remembers you in her prayers to the last day of her existence." This request Ambrosio expected and desired, yet he affected to raise objections, and to seem unwilling to keep his word. He told Jacintha that the ghost existed nowhere but in her own brain, and that her insisting upon his staying all night in the house was ridiculous and useless. Jacintha was obstinate. She was not to be convinced, and pressed him so urgently not to leave her a prey to the devil, that at length he granted her request. All this show of resistance imposed not upon Flora, who was naturally of a suspicious temper. She suspected the monk to be acting a part very contrary to his own inclinations, and that he wished for no better than to remain where he was. She even went so far as to believe that Jacintha was in his interest, and the poor old woman was immediately set down as no better than a procuress. While she applauded herself for having penetrated into this plot against her lady's honor, she resolved in secret to render it fruitless. "So then," said she to the abbot with a look half satirical and half indignant, "so then you mean to stay here tonight? Do so, in God's name. Nobody will prevent you. Sit up to watch for the ghost's arrival. I shall sit up too, and the Lord grant that I may see nothing worse than a ghost. I quit not Donna Antonia's bedside during this blessed night. Let me see any one dare to enter the room, and be he mortal or immortal, be he ghost, devil, or man, I warrant his repenting that ever he crossed the threshold." This hint was sufficiently strong, and Ambrosio understood its meaning, but instead of showing that he perceived her suspicions, he replied mildly that he approved the Juna's precautions, and advised her to persevere in her intention. This, she assured him faithfully that he may depend upon her doing. Jacintha then conducted him into the chamber where the ghost had appeared, and Flora returned to her ladies. Jacintha opened the door of the haunted room with a trembling hand. She ventured to peep in. but the wealth of India would not have tempted her to cross the threshold. She gave the taper to the monk, wished him well through the adventure, and hastened to be gone. Ambrosio entered. He bolted the door, placed the light upon the table, and seated himself in the chair which on the former night had sustained Antonia. In spite of Matilda's assurances that the spectre was a mere creation of fancy, his mind was impressed with a certain mysterious horror. He in vain endeavored to shake it off. The silence of the night, the story of the apparition, the chamber wainscoted with dark oak panels, the recollection which it brought with it of the murdered Elvira, and his incertitude respecting the nature of the drops given by him to Antonia made him feel uneasy at his present situation, but he thought much less of the spectre than of the poison. Should he have destroyed the only object which rendered life dear to him? Should the ghost's prediction prove true? Should Antonia in 3 days be no more, and he the wretched cause of her death? The supposition was too horrible to dwell upon. He drove away these dreadful images, and as often they presented themselves again before him, Matilda had assured him that the effects of the opiate would be speedy. He listened with fear, yet with eagerness, expecting to hear some disturbance in the adjoining chamber. All was still silent. He concluded that the drops had not begun to operate. Great was the stake for which he now played. A moment would suffice to decide upon his misery or happiness. Matilda had taught him the means of ascertaining that life was not extinct forever. Upon this essay depended all his hopes. With every instant his impatience redoubled, his terrors grew more lively, his anxiety more awake. Unable to bear this state of incertitude, he endeavored to divert it by substituting the thoughts of others to his own. The books, as was before mentioned, were ranged upon shelves near the table. This stood exactly opposite to the bed, which was placed in an alcove near the closet door. Ambrosio took down a volume and seated himself by the table, but his attention wandered from the pages before him. Antonia's image and that of the murdered Elvira persisted to force themselves before his imagination. Still he continued to read, though his eyes ran over the characters without his mind being conscious of their import. Such was his occupation. When he fancied that he heard a footstep, he turned his head, but no body was to be seen. He resumed his book, but in a few minutes after the same sound was repeated, and followed by a rustling noise close behind him. He now started from his seat, and looking round him, perceived the closet door standing half unclosed. On his first entering the room he had tried to open it, but found it bolted on the inside. "How is this?" said he to himself. "How comes this door unfastened?" He advanced towards it, he pushed it open, and looked into the closet. No one was there. While he stood irresolute, he thought that he distinguished a groaning in the adjacent chamber. It was Antonia's, and he supposed that the drops began to take effect. But upon listening more attentively, he found the noise to be caused by Jacintha, who had fallen asleep by the lady's bedside and was snoring most lustily. Ambrosio drew back and returned to the other room, musing upon the sudden opening of the closet door, for which he strove in vain to account. He paced the chamber up and down in silence. At length he stopped, and the bed attracted his attention. The curtain of the recess was but half drawn. He sighed involuntarily. "That bed," said he in a low voice, "that bed was Elvira's. There has she passed many a quiet night, for she was good and innocent. How sound must have been her sleep, and yet now she sleeps sounder. Does she truly sleep? Oh, God grant that she may. What if she rose from her grave at this sad and silent hour? What if she broke the bonds of the tomb and glided angrily before my blasted eyes? Oh, I never could support the sight. Again to see her form distorted by dying agonies, her blood-swollen veins, her livid countenance, her eyes bursting from their sockets with pain. To hear her speak of future punishment, menace me with heaven's vengeance, tax me with the crimes I have committed, with those I am going to commit. Great God, what is that?" As he uttered these words, his eyes, which were fixed upon the bed, saw the curtain shaken gently backwards and forwards. The apparition was recalled to his mind, and he almost fancied that he beheld Elvira's visionary form reclining upon the bed. A few moments' consideration sufficed to reassure him. "It was only the wind," said he, recovering himself. Again he paced the chamber, but an involuntary movement of awe and inquietude constantly led his eye towards the alcove. He drew near it with irresolution. He paused before he ascended the few steps which led to it. He put out his hand thrice to remove the curtain, and as often drew it back. "Absurd terrors!" he cried at length. Ashamed of his own weakness, hastily he mounted the steps, when a figure dressed in white started from the alcove, and gliding by him, made with precipitation towards the closet. Madness and despair now supplied the monk with that courage, of which he had till then been destitute. He flew down the steps, pursued the apparition, and attempted to grasp it. "Ghost, or devil, I hold you," he exclaimed, and seized the spectre by the arm. "Oh, Christ Jesus!" cried a shrill voice. "Holy Father, how you gripe me! I protest that I meant no harm." This address, as well as the arm which he held, convinced the abbot that the supposed ghost was substantial flesh and blood. He drew the intruder towards the table, and holding up the light, discovered the features of Madonna Flora. Incensed at having been betrayed by this trifling cause into fears so ridiculous, he asked her sternly what business had brought her to that chamber. Flora, shamed at being found out, and terrified at the severity of Ambrosio's looks, fell upon her knees and promised to make a full confession. "I protest, reverend father," said she, "that I am quite grieved at having disturbed you. Nothing was further from my intention. I meant to get out of the room as quietly as I got in, and had you been ignorant that I watched you, you know, it would have been the same thing as if I had not watched you at all. To be sure, I did very wrong in being a spy upon you, that I cannot deny. But Lord, your reverence, how can a poor weak woman resist curiosity? Mine was so strong to know what you were doing, that I could not but try to get a little peep, without anybody knowing anything about it. So with that I left old Dame Jacintha sitting by my lady's bed, and I ventured to steal into the closet. Being unwilling to interrupt you, I contented myself at first with putting my eye to the keyhole, but as I could see nothing by this means, I undrew the bolt, and while your back was turned to the alcove, I whipped me in softly and silently. Here I lay snug behind the curtain, till your reverence found me out, and seized me before I had time to regain the closet door. This is the whole truth, I assure you, Holy Father, and I beg your pardon 1,000 times for my impertinence." During this speech the abbot had time to recollect himself. He was satisfied with reading the penitent's vile lecture upon the dangers of curiosity and the meanness of the action in which she had been just discovered. Flora declared herself fully persuaded that she had done wrong. She promised never to be guilty of the same fault again, and was retiring very humble and contrite to Antonia's chamber, when the closet door was suddenly thrown open, and in rushed Jacintha pale and out of breath. "Oh, Father, Father," she cried in a voice almost choked with terror, "what shall I do? What shall I do? Here is a fine piece of work. Nothing but misfortunes, nothing but dead people and dying people. Oh, I shall go distracted. I shall go distracted." "Speak, speak," cried Flora and the monk at the same time. "What has happened? What is the matter?" "Oh, I shall have another course in my house, some which has certainly cast a spell upon it, upon me, and upon all about me. Poor Donna Antonia, there she lies in just such convulsions as killed her mother. The ghost told her true. I am sure the ghost has told her true." Flora ran, or rather flew to her lady's chamber. Ambrosio followed her, his bosom trembling with hope and apprehension. They found Antonia as Jacintha had described, torn by racking convulsions from which they in vain endeavored to relieve her. The monk dispatched Jacintha to the abbey in all haste, and commissioned her to bring Father Pablo's back with her, without losing a moment. "I will go for him," replied Jacintha, "and tell him to come here, but as to bringing him myself, I shall do no such thing. I am sure that the house is bewitched, and burn me if ever I set foot in it again." With this resolution she set out for the monastery, and delivered to Father Pablo's the abbot's orders. She then betook herself to the house of old Simon Gonzales, whom she resolved never to quit, till she had made him her husband, and his dwelling her own. Father Pablos had no sooner beheld Antonia than he pronounced her incurable. The convulsions continued for an hour. During that time her agonies were much milder than those which her groans created in the abbot's heart. Her every pang seemed a dagger in his bosom, and he cursed himself 1,000 times for having adopted so barbarous a project. The hour being expired, by degrees the fits became less frequent, and Antonia less agitated. She felt that her dissolution was approaching, and that nothing could save her. "Worthy Ambrosio," she said in a feeble voice, while she pressed his hand to her lips, "I am now at liberty to express how grateful is my heart for your attention and kindness. I am upon the bed of death, yet an hour, and I shall be no more. I may therefore acknowledge without restraint that to relinquish your society was very painful to me, but such was the will of a parent, and I dared not disobey. I die without repugnance. There are few who will lament my leaving them. There are few whom I lament to leave. Among those few, I lament for none more than for yourself. But we shall meet again, Ambrosio. We shall one day meet in heaven. There shall our friendship be renewed, and my mother shall view it with pleasure." She paused. The abbot shuddered when she mentioned Elvira. Antonia imputed his emotion to pity and concern for her. "You are grieved for me, father," she continued. "Ah, sigh not for my loss. I have no crimes to repent, at least none of which I am conscious, and I restore my soul without fear to him from whom I received it. I have but few requests to make, yet let me hope that what few I have shall be granted. Let a solemn mass be said for my soul's repose, and another for that of my beloved mother. Not that I doubt her resting in her grave. I am now convinced that my reason wandered, and the falsehood of the ghost's prediction is sufficient to prove my error. But every one has some failing. My mother may have had hers, though I knew them not. I therefore wish a mass to be celebrated for her repose, and the expense may be defrayed by the little wealth of which I am possessed. Whatever may then remain, I bequeath to my Aunt Leonela. When I am dead, let the Marquis de las Cisternas know that his brother's unhappy family can no longer importune him. But disappointment makes me unjust. They tell me that he is ill, and perhaps had it been in his power, he wished to have protected me. Tell him then, father, only that I am dead, and that if he had any faults to me, I forgave him from my heart. This done, I have nothing more to ask for than your prayers. Promise to remember my requests, and I shall resign my life without a pang or sorrow." Ambrosio engaged to comply with her desires, and proceeded to give her absolution. Every moment announced the approach of Antonia's fate. Her sight failed, her heart beat sluggishly, her fingers stiffened and grew cold, and at 2 in the morning she expired without a groan. As soon as the breath had forsaken her body, Father Pablos retired, sincerely affected at the melancholy scene. On her part, Flora gave way to the most unbridled sorrow. Far different concerns employed Ambrosio. He sought for the pulse whose throbbing, so Matilda had assured him, would prove Antonia's death but temporal. He found it, he pressed it. It palpitated beneath his hand, and his heart was filled with ecstasy. However, he carefully concealed his satisfaction at the success of his plan. He assumed a melancholy air, and addressing himself to Flora, warned her against abandoning herself to fruitless sorrow. Her tears were too sincere to permit her listening to his counsels, and she continued to weep unceasingly. The friar withdrew, first promising to give orders himself about the funeral, which, out of consideration for Jacintha as he pretended, should take place with all expedition. Plunged in grief for the loss of her beloved mistress, Flora scarcely attended to what he said. Ambrosio hastened to command the burial. He obtained permission from the prioress that the corse should be deposited in St. Clare's sepulchre, and on the Friday morning, every proper and needful ceremony being performed, Antonia's body was committed to the tomb. On the same day Leonela arrived at Madrid, intending to present her young husband to Elvira. Various circumstances had obliged her to defer her journey from Tuesday to Friday, and she had no opportunity of making this alteration in her plans known to her sister. As her heart was truly affectionate, and as she had ever entertained a sincere regard for Elvira and her daughter, her surprise at hearing of their sudden and melancholy fate was fully equaled by her sorrow and disappointment. Ambrosio sent to inform her of Antonia's bequest. At her solicitation, he promised, as soon as Elvira's trifling debts were discharged, to transmit to her the remainder. Chapter 10. Oh, could I worship aught beneath the skies, that earth has seen or fancy could devise, yours altar, sacred library, should stand, built by no mercenary vulgar hand, with fragrant turf, and flowers as wild and fair as ever dressed a bank, or scented summer air. Howper, his whole attention bent upon bringing to justice the assassins of his sister, Lorenzo little thought how severely his interest was suffering in another quarter. As was before mentioned, he returned not to Madrid till the evening of that day on which Antonio was buried, signifying to the Grand Inquisitor the order of the Cardinal Duke, a ceremony not to be neglected, when a member of the church was to be arrested publicly communicating his design to his uncle and Don Ramirez, and assembling a troop of attendants sufficiently to prevent opposition, furnished him with full occupation during the few hours preceding midnight. Consequently, he had no opportunity to inquire about his mistress, and was perfectly ignorant both of her death and her mother's. The Marquis was by no means out of danger, his delirium was gone, but had left him so much exhausted that the physicians declined pronouncing upon the consequences likely to ensue. As for Raymond himself, he wished for nothing more earnestly than to join Agnes in the grave. Existence was hateful to him, he saw nothing in the world deserving his attention, and he hoped to hear that Agnes was revenged, and himself given over in the same moment. Followed by Raymond's ardent prayers for success, Lorenzo was at the gates of St. Clare a full hour before the time appointed by the mother St. Ursula. He was accompanied by his uncle, by Don Ramirez de Mello, and a party of chosen archers. Though in considerable numbers, their appearance created no surprise. A great crowd was already assembled before the convent doors, in order to witness the procession. It was naturally supposed that Lorenzo and his attendants were conducted there by the same design. The Duke of Medina being recognized, the people drew back, and made way for his party to advance. Lorenzo placed himself opposite to the great gate, through which the pilgrims were to pass. Convinced that the prioress could not escape him, he waited patiently for her appearance, which she was expected to make exactly at midnight. The nuns were employed in religious duties established in honor of St. Clare, and to which no profane was ever admitted. The chapel windows were illuminated. As they stood on the outside, the auditors heard the full swell of the organ, accompanied by a chorus of female voices, rise upon the stillness of the night. This died away, and was succeeded by a single strain of harmony. It was the voice of her who was destined to sustain in the procession the character of St. Clare. For this office the most beautiful virgin of Madrid was always selected, and she upon whom the choice fell esteemed it as the highest of honors. While listening to the music, whose melody distance only seemed to render sweeter, the audience was wrapped up in profound attention. Universal silence prevailed through the crowd, and every heart was filled with reverence for religion. Every heart but Lorenzo's, conscious that among those who chanted the praises of their God so sweetly, there were some who cloaked with devotion the foulest sins. Their hymns inspired him with detestation at their hypocrisy. He had long observed with disapprobation and contempt the superstition which governed Madrid's inhabitants. His good sense had pointed out to him the artifices of the monks and the gross absurdity of their miracles, wonders, and supposititious relics. He blushed to see his countrymen the dupes of deceptions so ridiculous, and only wished for an opportunity to free them from their monkish fetters. That opportunity, so long desired in vain, was at length presented to him. He resolved not to let it slip, but to set before the people in glaring colors how enormous were the abuses but too frequently practiced in monasteries, and how unjustly public esteem was bestowed indiscriminately upon all who wore a religious habit. He longed for the moment destined to unmask the hypocrites, and convince his countrymen that a sanctified exterior does not always hide a virtuous heart. The service lasted till midnight was announced by the convent bell. That sound being heard, the music ceased, the voices died away softly, and soon after the lights disappeared from the chapel windows. Lorenzo's heart beat high when he found the execution of his plan to be at hand. From the natural superstition of the people, he had prepared himself for some resistance, but he trusted that the Mother Saint Ursula would bring good reasons to justify his proceeding. He had force with him to repel the first impulse of the populace, till his arguments should be heard. His only fear was lest the domina, suspecting his design, should have spirited away the nun on whose deposition everything depended. Unless the Mother Saint Ursula should be present, he could only accuse the prioress upon suspicion, and this reflection gave him some little apprehension for the success of his enterprise. The tranquillity which seemed to reign through the convent in some degree reassured him. Still he expected the moment eagerly when the presence of his ally should deprive him of the power of doubting. The Abbey of Capuchins was only separated from the convent by the garden and cemetery. The monks had been invited to assist at the pilgrimage. They now arrived, marching 2 by 2 with lighted torches in their hands and chanting hymns in honor of St. Clare. Father Pablo's was at their head, the abbot having excused himself from attending. The people made way for the holy train, and the friars placed themselves in ranks on either side of the great gates. A few minutes sufficed to arrange the order of the procession. This being settled, the convent doors were thrown open, and again the female chorus sounded in full melody. First appeared a band of choristers. As soon as they had passed, the monks fell in 2 by 2, and followed with steps slow and measured. Next came the novices. They bore no tapers, as did the professed, but moved on with eyes bent downwards and seemed to be occupied by telling their beads. To them succeeded a young and lovely girl, who represented St. Lucia. She held a golden basin in which were 2 eyes. Her own were covered by a velvet bandage, and she was conducted by another nun habited as an angel. She was followed by St. Catherine, a palm branch in one hand, a flaming sword in the other. She was robed in white, and her brow was ornamented with a sparkling diadem. After her appeared St. Genevieve, surrounded by a number of imps, who, putting themselves into grotesque attitudes, drawing her by the robe, and sporting round her with antic gestures, endeavored to distract her attention from the book, on which her eyes were constantly fixed. These merry devils greatly entertained the spectators, who testified their pleasure by repeated bursts of laughter. The prioress had been careful to select a nun whose disposition was naturally solemn and saturnine. She had every reason to be satisfied with her choice. The drolleries of the imps were entirely thrown away, and St. Genevieve moved on without discomposing a muscle. Each of these saints was separated from the other by a band of choristers, exalting her praise in their hymns, but declaring her to be very much inferior to St. Clare, the convent's avowed patroness. These having passed, a long train of nuns appeared, bearing like the choristers each a burning taper. Next came the relics of St. Clare, enclosed in vases equally precious for their materials and workmanship, but they attracted not Lorenzo's attention. The nun who bore the heart occupied him entirely. According to Theodore's description, he doubted not her being the Mother Saint Ursula. She seemed to look round with anxiety. As he stood foremost in the rank by which the procession passed, her eye caught Lorenzo's. A flush of joy overspread her till then pallid cheek. She turned to her companion eagerly. "We are safe," he heard her whisper. "It is her brother." His heart being now at ease, Lorenzo gazed with tranquillity upon the remainder of the show. Now appeared its most brilliant ornament. It was a machine fashioned like a throne, rich with jewels and dazzling with light. It rolled onwards upon concealed wheels, and was guided by several lovely children dressed as seraphs. The summit was covered with silver clouds, upon which reclined the most beautiful form that eyes ever witnessed. It was a damsel representing St. Clare. Her dress was of inestimable price, and round her head a wreath of diamonds formed an artificial glory, but all these ornaments yielded to the luster of her charms. As she advanced, a murmur of delight ran through the crowd. Evening Lorenzo confessed secretly that he never beheld more perfect beauty, and had not his heart been Antonia's, it must have fallen a sacrifice to this enchanting girl. As it was, he considered her only as a fine statue. She obtained from him no tribute save cold admiration. and when she had passed him, he thought of her no more. "Who is she?" asked a bystander in Lorenzo's hearing. "One whose beauty you must often have heard celebrated. Her name is Virginia de Villafranca. She is a pensioner of St. Clare's convent, a relation of the prioress, and has been selected with justice as the ornament of the procession." The throne moved onwards. It was followed by the prioress herself. She marched at the head of the remaining nuns with a devout and sanctified air and closed the procession. She moved on slowly. Her eyes were raised to heaven, her countenance calm and tranquil, seemed abstracted from all sublunary things, and no feature betrayed her secret pride at displaying the pomp and opulence of her convent. She passed along, accompanied by the prayers and benedictions of the populace. But how great was the general confusion and surprise when Don Ramirez, starting forward, challenged her as his prisoner. For a moment amazement held the domina silent and immovable, but no sooner did she recover herself than she exclaimed against sacrilege and impiety, and called the people to rescue a daughter of the church. They were eagerly preparing to obey her, when Don Ramirez, protected by the archers from their rage, commanded them to forbear, and threatened them with the severest vengeance of the Inquisition. At that dreaded word every arm fell, every sword shrunk back into its scabbard. The prioress herself turned pale and trembled. The general silence convinced her that she had nothing to hope but from innocence, and she besought Don Ramirez in a faltering voice to inform her of what crime she was accused. "That ye shall know in time," replied he, "but first I must secure the mother saint." "Ursula, the mother saint, Ursula," repeated the domina faintly. At this moment, casting her eyes round, she saw near her Lorenzo and the Duke, who had followed Don Ramirez. "Ah, great God!" she cried, clasping her hands together with a frantic air, "I am betrayed." "Betrayed?" replied Saint Ursula, who now arrived, conducted by some of the archers, and followed by the nun her companion in the procession. "Not betrayed, but discovered. In me recognize your accuser. You know not how well I am instructed in your guilt. Señor," she continued, turning to Don Ramirez, "I commit myself to your custody. I charge the prioress of St. Clare with murder, and stake my life for the justice of my accusation." A general cry of surprise was uttered by the whole audience, and an explanation was demanded loudly. The trembling nuns, terrified at the noise and universal confusion, had dispersed and fled different ways. Some regained the convent, others sought refuge in the dwellings of their relations, and many, only sensible of their present danger and anxious to escape from the tumult, ran through the streets and wandered, they knew not where. The lovely Virginia was one of the first to fly, and in order that she may be better seen and heard, the people desired that St. Ursula should harangue them from the vacant throne. The nun complied. She ascended the glittering machine, and then addressed the surrounding multitude as follows: "However strange and unseemly may appear my conduct, when considered to be adopted by a female and a nun, necessity will justify it most fully. A secret, and horrible secret, weighs heavy upon my soul. No rest can be mine till I have revealed it to the world, and satisfied that innocent blood which calls from the grave for vengeance. Much have I dared to gain this opportunity of lightening my conscience. Had I failed in my attempt to reveal the crime, had the domina but suspected that the mystery was known to me, my ruin was inevitable. Angels who watch unceasingly over those who deserve their favor have enabled me to escape detection. I am now at liberty to relate a tale whose circumstances will freeze every honest soul with horror. Mine is the task to rend the veil from hypocrisy and show misguided parents to what dangers the woman is exposed who falls under the sway of a monastic tyrant. Among the votaries of St. Clare, none was more lovely, none more gentle, than Agnes de Medina. I knew her well. She entrusted to me every secret of her heart. I was her friend and confidant, and I loved her with sincere affection. Nor was I singular in my attachment. Her piety unfeigned, her willingness to oblige, and her angelic disposition rendered her the darling of all that was estimable in the convent. The prioress herself, proud, scrupulous, and forbidding, could not refuse Agnes that tribute of approbation which she bestowed upon no one else. Every one has some fault, alas! Agnes had her weakness. She violated the laws of our order, and incurred the inveterate hate of the unforgiving Domina. St. Clair's rules are severe, but grown antiquated and neglected, many of late years have either been forgotten or changed by universal consent into milder punishments. The penance adjudged to the crime of Agnes was most cruel, most inhuman. The law had been long exploded, alas, it still existed, and the revengeful prioress now determined to revive it. This law decreed that the offender should be plunged into a private dungeon, expressly constituted to hide from the world forever the victim of cruelty and tyrannic superstition. In this dreadful abode she was to lead a perpetual solitude, deprived of all society, and believed to be dead by those whom affection may have prompted to attempt her rescue. Thus was she to languish out the remainder of her days, with no other food than bread and water, and no other comfort than the free indulgence of her tears. The indignation created by this account was so violent as for some moments to interrupt St. Ursula's narrative. When the disturbance ceased and silence again prevailed through the assembly, she continued her discourse, while at every word the Domina's countenance betrayed her increasing terrors. A council of the 12 elder nuns was called. I was of the number. The prioress in exaggerated colors described the offense of Agnes, and scrupled not to propose the revival of this almost forgotten law. To the shame of our sex be it spoken, that either so absolute was the Domina's will in the convent, or so much had disappointment, solitude, and self-denial hardened their hearts and soured their tempers, that this barbarous proposal was assented to by 9 voices out of the 12. I was not one of the 9. Frequent opportunities had convinced me of the virtues of Agnes, and I loved and pitied her most sincerely. The mothers Bertha and Cornelia joined my party. We made the strongest opposition possible, and the superior found herself compelled to change her intention. In spite of the majority in her favor, she feared to break with us openly. She knew that supported by the Medina family, our forces would be too strong for her to cope with, and she also knew that after being once imprisoned and supposed dead, should Agnes be discovered, her ruin would be inevitable. She therefore gave up her design, though with much reluctance. She demanded some days to reflect upon a mode of punishment which may be agreeable to the whole community, and she promised that as soon as her resolution was fixed, the same council should be again summoned. 2 days passed away. On the evening of the 3rd it was announced that on the next day Agnes should be examined, and that according to her behavior on that occasion, her punishment should be either strengthened or mitigated. On the night preceding this examination, I stole to the cell of Agnes at an hour when I supposed the other nuns to be buried in sleep. I comforted her to the best of my power. I bade her take courage, told her to rely upon the support of her friends, and taught her certain signs, by which I may instruct her to answer the Domina's questions by an assent or negative. Conscious that her enemy would strive to confuse, embarrass, and daunt her, I feared her being ensnared into some confession prejudicial to her interests. Being anxious to keep my visit secret, I stayed with Agnes but a short time. I bade her not let her spirits be cast down. I mingled my tears with those which streamed down her cheek, embraced her fondly, and was on the point of retiring, when I heard the sound of steps approaching the cell. I started back. A curtain which veiled a large crucifix offered me a retreat, and I hastened to place myself behind it. The door opened. The prioress entered, followed by 4 other nuns. They advanced towards the bed of Agnes. The superior reproached her with her errors in the bitterest terms. She told her that she was a disgrace to the convent, that she was resolved to deliver the world and herself from such a monster, and commanded her to drink the contents of a goblet now presented to her by one of the nuns. Aware of the fatal properties of the liquor, and trembling to find herself upon the brink of eternity, the unhappy girl strove to excite the Domina's pity by the most affecting prayers. She sued for life in terms which may have melted the heart of a fiend. She promised to submit patiently to any punishment, to shame, imprisonment, and torture, may she but be permitted to live. Oh, may she but live another month, or week, or day. Her merciless enemy listened to her complaints unmoved. She told her that at first she meant to have spared her life, and that if she had altered her intention, she had to thank the opposition of her friends. She continued to insist upon her swallowing the poison. She bade her recommend herself to the Almighty's mercy, not to hers, and assured her that in an hour she would be numbered with the dead. Perceiving that it was vain to implore this unfeeling woman, she attempted to spring from her bed and call for assistance. She hoped, if she could not escape the fate announced to her, at least to have witnesses of the violence committed. The prioress guessed her design. She seized her forcibly by the arm and pushed her back upon her pillow, at the same time drawing a dagger and placing it at the breast of the unfortunate Agnes. She protested that if she uttered a single cry or hesitated a single moment to drink the poison, she would pierce her heart that instant. Already half dead with fear, she could make no further resistance. The nun approached with the fatal goblet. The domina obliged her to take it and swallow the contents. She drank, and the horrid deed was accomplished. The nuns then seated themselves round the bed. They answered her groans with reproaches. They interrupted with sarcasms the prayers in which she recommended her parting soul to mercy. They threatened her with heaven's vengeance and eternal perdition. They bade her despair of pardon, and strode with yet sharper thorns death's painful pillow. Such were the sufferings of this young unfortunate, till released by fate from the malice of her tormentors. She expired in horror of the past, in fears for the future, and her agonies were such as must have amply gratified the hate and vengeance of her enemies. As soon as her victim ceased to breathe, the domina retired and was followed by her accomplices. It was now that I ventured from my concealment. I dared not to assist my unhappy friend, aware that without preserving her, I should only have brought on myself the same destruction. Shocked and terrified beyond expression at this horrid scene, scarcely had I sufficient strength to regain my cell. As I reached the door of that of Agnes, I ventured to look towards the bed, on which lay her lifeless body, once so lovely and so sweet. I breathed a prayer for her departed spirit, and vowed to revenge her death by the shame and punishment of her assassins. With danger and difficulty have I kept my oath. I unwarily dropped some words at the funeral of Agnes, while thrown off my guard by excessive grief, which alarmed the guilty conscience of the prioress. My every action was observed, my every step was traced. I was constantly surrounded by the superior's spies. It was long before I could find the means of conveying to the unhappy girl's relations an intimation of my secret. It was given out that Agnes had expired suddenly. This account was credited not only by her friends in Madrid, but even by those within the convent. The poison had left no marks upon her body, no one suspected the true cause of her death, and it remained unknown to all, save the assassins and myself. I have no more to say, for what I have already said I will answer with my life. I repeat that the prioress is a murderess, that she has driven from the world, perhaps from heaven, an unfortunate whose offense was light and venial, that she has abused the power entrusted to her hands, and has been a tyrant, a barbarian, and an hypocrite. I also accuse the 4 nuns, Violante, Camilla, Alex, and Mariana, as being her accomplices and equally criminal. Here St. Ursula ended her narrative. It created horror and surprise throughout. But when she related the inhuman murder of Agnes, the indignation of the mob was so audibly testified that it was scarcely possible to hear the conclusion. This confusion increased with every moment. At length a multitude of voices exclaimed that the prioress should be given up to their fury. To this Don Ramirez refused to consent positively. Evening Lorenzo bade the people remember that she had undergone no trial, and advised them to leave her punishment to the Inquisition. All representations were fruitless. The disturbance grew still more violent, and the populace more exasperated. In vain did Ramirez attempt to convey his prisoner out of the throng. Wherever he turned, a band of rioters barred his passage, and demanded her being delivered over to them more loudly than before. Ramirez ordered his attendants to cut their way through the multitude. Oppressed by numbers, it was impossible for them to draw their swords. He threatened the mob with the vengeance of the Inquisition, but in this moment of popular frenzy evening this dreadful name had lost its effect. Though regret for his sister made him look upon the prioress with abhorrence, Lorenzo could not help pitying a woman in a situation so terrible, but in spite of all his exertions, and those of the Duke, of Don Ramirez, and the archers, the people continued to press onwards. They forced a passage through the guards who protected their destined victim, dragged her from her shelter, and proceeded to take upon her a most summary and cruel vengeance. Wild with terror, and scarcely knowing what she said, the wretched woman shrieked for a moment's mercy. She protested that she was innocent of the death of Agnes, and could clear herself from the suspicion beyond the power of doubt. The rioters heeded nothing but the gratification of their barbarous vengeance. They refused to listen to her. They showed her every sort of insult, loaded her with mud and filth, and called her by the most opprobrious appellations. They tore her one from another, and each new tormentor was more savage than the former. They stifled with howls and execrations her shrill cries for mercy, and dragged her through the streets, spurning her, trampling her, and treating her with every species of cruelty which hate or vindictive fury could invent. At length a flint, aimed by some well-directing hand, struck her full upon the temple. She sank upon the ground bathed in blood, and in a few minutes terminated her miserable existence. Yet, though she no longer felt their insults, the rioters still exercised their impotent rage upon her lifeless body. They beat it, trod upon it, and ill-used it, till it became no more than a mass of flesh, unsightly, shapeless, and disgusting. Unable to prevent this shocking event, Lorenzo and his friends had beheld it with the utmost horror, but they were roused from their compelled inactivity on hearing that the mob was attacking the convent of St. Clare. The incensed populace, confounding the innocent with the guilty, had resolved to sacrifice all the nuns of that order to their rage, and not to leave one stone of the building upon another. Alarmed at this intelligence, they hastened to the convent, resolved to defend it if possible, or at least to rescue the inhabitants from the fury of the rioters. Most of the nuns had fled, but a few still remained in their habitation. Their situation was truly dangerous. However, as they had taken the precaution of fastening the inner gates, with this assistance Lorenzo hoped to repel the mob till Don Ramirez should return to him with a more sufficient force. Having been conducted by the former disturbance to the distance of some streets from the convent, he did not immediately reach it. When he arrived, the throng surrounding it was so excessive as to prevent his approaching the gates. In the interim, the populace besieged the building with persevering rage. They battered the walls, threw lighted torches in at the windows, and swore that by break of day not a nun of St. Clare's order should be left alive. Lorenzo had just succeeded in piercing his way through the crowd, when one of the gates was forced open. The rioters poured into the interior part of the building, where they exercised their vengeance upon everything which found itself in their passage. They broke the furniture into pieces, tore down the pictures, destroyed the relics, and in their hatred of her servant forgot all respect to the saint. Some employed themselves in searching out the nuns, others in pulling down parts of the convent, and others again in setting fire to the pictures and valuable furniture which it contained. These latter produced the most decisive desolation. Truly, the consequences of their action were more sudden than themselves had expected or wished. The flames rising from the burning piles caught part of the building, which being old and dry, the conflagration spread with rapidity from room to room. The walls were soon shaken by the devouring element, the columns gave way, the roofs came tumbling down upon the rioters and crushed many of them beneath their weight. Nothing was to be heard but shrieks and groans. The convent was wrapped in flames, and the whole presented a scene of devastation and horror. Lorenzo was shocked at having been the cause, however innocent, of this frightful disturbance. He endeavored to repair his fault by protecting the helpless inhabitants of the convent. He entered it with the mob, and exerted himself to repress the prevailing fury, till the sudden and alarming progress of the flames compelled him to provide for his own safety. The people now hurried out, as eagerly as they had before thronged in, but their numbers clogging up the doorway, and the fire gaining upon them rapidly, many of them perished before they had time to effect their escape. Lorenzo's good fortune directed him to a small door in a farther aisle of the chapel. The bolt was already undrawn. He opened the door and found himself at the foot of St. Clare's sepulchre. Here he stopped to breathe. The Duke and some of his attendants had followed him, and thus were in security for the present. They now consulted what steps they should take to escape from the scene of disturbance, but their deliberations were considerably interrupted by the sight of volumes of fire rising from amidst the convent's massy walls, by the noise of some heavy arch tumbling down in ruins, or by the mingled shrieks of the nuns and rioters, either suffocating in the press, perishing in the flames, or crushed beneath the weight of the falling mansion. Lorenzo inquired where the wicket led. He was answered, to the garden of the Capuchins, and it was resolved to explore an outlet upon that side. Accordingly, the Duke raised the latch, and passed into the adjoining cemetery. The attendants followed without ceremony. Lorenzo, being the last, was also on the point of quitting the colonnade, when he saw the door of the sepulchre open softly. Someone looked out, but on perceiving strangers uttered a loud shriek, started back again, and flew down the marble stairs. "What can this mean?" cried Lorenzo. "Here is some mystery concealed. Follow me without delay." Thus saying, he hastened into the sepulchre, and pursued the person who continued to fly before him. The Duke knew not the cause of his exclamation, but supposing that he had good reasons for it, he followed him without hesitation. The others did the same, and the whole party soon arrived at the foot of the stairs. The upper door having been left open, the neighboring flames darted from above a sufficient light to enable Lorenzo's catching a glance of the fugitive running through the long passages and distant vaults. But when a sudden turn deprived him of this assistance, total darkness succeeded, and he could only trace the object of his inquiry by the faint echo of retiring feet. The pursuers were now compelled to proceed with caution, as well as they could judge. The fugitive also seemed to slacken pace, for they heard the steps follow each other at longer intervals. They at length were bewildered by the labyrinth of passages and dispersed in various directions, carried away by his eagerness to clear up this mystery, and to penetrate into which he was impelled by a movement secret and unaccountable. Lorenzo heeded not this circumstance till he found himself in total solitude. The noise of footsteps had ceased. All was silent around, and no clue offered itself to guide him to the flying person. He stopped to reflect on the means most likely to aid his pursuit. He was persuaded that no common cause would have induced the fugitive to seek that dreary place at an hour so unusual. The cry which he had heard seemed uttered in a voice of terror, and he was convinced that some mystery was attached to this event. After some minutes passed in hesitation, he continued to proceed, feeling his way along the walls of the passage. He had already passed some time in this slow progress, when he descried a spark of light glimmering at a distance. Guided by this observation, and having drawn his sword, he bent his steps towards the place from where the beam seemed to be emitted. It proceeded from the lamp which flamed before St. Clare's statue. Before it stood several females, their white garments streaming in the blast as it howled along the vaulted dungeons. Curious to know what had brought them together in this melancholy spot, Lorenzo drew near with precaution. The strangers seemed earnestly engaged in conversation. They heard not Lorenzo's steps, and he approached unobserved, till he could hear their voices distinctly. "I protest," continued she who was speaking when he arrived, and to whom the rest were listening with great attention, "I protest that I saw them with my own eyes. I flew down the steps, they pursued me, and I escaped falling into their hands with difficulty. Had it not been for the lamp, I should never have found you." "And what could bring them here?" said another in a trembling voice. "Do you think that they were looking for us?" "God grant that my fears may be false," rejoined the first, "but I doubt they are murderers. If they discover us, we are lost. As for me, my fate is certain. My affinity to the prioress will be a sufficient crime to condemn me, and though till now these vaults have afforded me a retreat here." Looking up, her eye fell upon Lorenzo, who had continued to approach softly. "The murderers!" she cried. She started away from the statue's pedestal on which she had been seated, and attempted to escape by flight. Her companions at the same moment uttered a terrified scream, while Lorenzo arrested the fugitive by the arm. Frightened and desperate, she sank upon her knees before him. "Spare me!" she exclaimed. "For Christ's sake, spare me!" I'm innocent, truly, I am. While she spoke, her voice was almost choked with fear, the beams of the lamp darting full upon her face, which was unveiled. Lorenzo recognized the beautiful Virginia de Villafranca. He hastened to raise her from the ground and besought her to take courage. He promised to protect her from the rioters, assured her that her retreat was still a secret, and that she may depend upon his readiness to defend her to the last drop of his blood. During this conversation, the nuns had thrown themselves into various attitudes. One knelt and addressed herself to heaven, another hid her face in the lap of her neighbor. Some listened motionless with fear to the discourse of the supposed assassin, while others embraced the statue of St. Clare and implored her protection with frantic cries. Unperceiving their mistake, they crowded round Lorenzo and heaped benedictions on him by dozens. He found that, on hearing the threats of the mob, and terrified by the cruelties which from the convent towers they had seen inflicted on the superior, many of the pensioners and nuns had taken refuge in the sepulchre. Among the former was to be reckoned the lovely Virginia, nearly related to the prioress. She had more reason than the rest to dread the rioters, and now besought Lorenzo earnestly not to abandon her to their rage. Her companions, most of whom were women of noble family, made the same request, which he readily granted. He promised not to quit them till he had seen each of them safe in the arms of her relations, but he advised their deferring to quit the sepulchre for some time longer, when the popular fury should be somewhat calmed, and the arrival of military force have dispersed the multitude. Would to God, cried Virginia, that I were already safe in my mother's embraces. How say you, Segner, will it be long before we may leave this place? Every moment that I pass here, I pass in torture. I hope, not long, said he, but till you can proceed with security. This sepulchre will prove an impenetrable asylum. Here you run no risk of a discovery, and I would advise your remaining quiet for the next 2 or 3 hours. 2 or 3 hours? Exclaimed Sister Helena. If I stay another hour in these vaults, I shall expire with fear. Not the wealth of worlds should bribe me to undergo again what I have suffered since my coming here. Blessed Virgin, to be in this melancholy place in the middle of night, surrounded by the mouldering bodies of my deceased companions, and expecting every moment to be torn in pieces by their ghosts who wander about me, and complain, and groan, and wail in accents that make my blood run cold. Christ Jesus, it is enough to drive me to madness. Excuse me, replied Lorenzo, if I am surprised that while menaced by real woes you are capable of yielding to imaginary dangers. These terrors are puerile and groundless. Combat them, holy sister. I have promised to guard you from the rioters, but against the attacks of superstition you must depend for protection upon yourself. The idea of ghosts is ridiculous in the extreme, and if you continue to be swayed by ideal terrors— Ideal, exclaimed the nuns with one voice. Why, we heard it ourselves, Segner. Every one of us heard it. It was frequently repeated, and it sounded every time more melancholy and deep. You will never persuade me that we could all have been deceived. Not we, truly, no, no, had the noise been merely created by fancy. Hark, hark, interrupted Virginia in a voice of terror. God preserve us. There it is again. The nuns clasped their hands together and sank upon their knees. Lorenzo looked round him eagerly, and was on the point of yielding to the fears which already had possessed the women. Universal silence prevailed. He examined the vault, but nothing was to be seen. He now prepared to address the nuns and ridicule their childish apprehensions, when his attention was arrested by a deep and long-drawn groan. What was that? He cried, and started. There, Segner, said Helena. Now you must be convinced. You have heard the noise yourself. Now judge whether our terrors are imaginary. Since we have been here, that groaning has been repeated almost every 5 minutes. Doubtless, it proceeds from some soul in pain, who wishes to be prayed out of purgatory, but none of us here dares ask it the question. As for me, were I to see an apparition, the fright, I am very certain, would kill me out of hand. As she said this, a second groan was heard yet more distinctly. The nuns crossed themselves and hastened to repeat their prayers against evil spirits. Lorenzo listened attentively. He evening thought. that he could distinguish sounds, as of one speaking in complaint, but distance rendered them inarticulate. The noise seemed to come from the amid of the small vault in which he and the nuns then were, and which a multitude of passages branching out in various directions formed into a sort of star. Lorenzo's curiosity, which was ever awake, made him anxious to solve this mystery. He desired that silence may be kept. The nuns obeyed him. All was hushed, till the general stillness was again disturbed by the groaning, which was repeated several times successively. He perceived it to be most audible, when upon following the sound he was conducted close to the shrine of St. Clare. "The noise comes from therefore," said he. "Whose is this statue?" Helena, to whom he addressed the question, paused for a moment. Suddenly she clapped her hands together. "Ay," cried she, "it must be so. I have discovered the meaning of these groans." The nuns crowded round her, and besought her eagerly to explain herself. She gravely replied that for time immemorial the statue had been famous for performing miracles. From this she inferred that the saint was concerned at the conflagration of a convent which she protected, and expressed her grief by audible lamentations. Not having equal faith in the miraculous saint, Lorenzo did not think this solution of the mystery quite so satisfactory as the nuns, who subscribed to it without hesitation. In one point, it is true, that he agreed with Helena. He suspected that the groans proceeded from the statue. The more he listened, the more was he confirmed in this idea. He drew nearer to the image, designing to inspect it more closely, but perceiving his intention, the nuns besought him for God's sake to desist, since if he touched the statue, his death was inevitable. "And in what consists the danger?" said he. "Mother of God." "In what?" replied Helena, ever eager to relate a miraculous adventure. "If you had only heard the 100th part of those marvelous stories about this statue which the Domina used to recount. She assured us often and often that if we only dared to lay a finger upon it, we may expect the most fatal consequences. Among other things, she told us that a robber having entered these vaults by night, he observed over their ruby, whose value is inestimable. Do you see it, Seger? It sparkles upon the third finger of the hand, in which she holds a crown of thorns. This jewel naturally excited the villain's cupidity. He resolved to make himself master of it. For this purpose he ascended the pedestal. He supported himself by grasping the saint's right arm, and extended his own towards the ring. What was his surprise, when he saw the statue's hand raised in a posture of menace, and heard her lips pronounce his eternal perdition. Penetrated with awe and consternation, he desisted from his attempt, and prepared to quit the sepulchre. In this he also failed. Flight was denied him. He found it impossible to disengage the hand which rested upon the right arm of the statue. In vain did he struggle. He remained fixed to the image, till the insupportable and fiery anguish which darted itself through his veins compelled his shrieking for assistance. The sepulchre was now filled with spectators. The villain confessed his sacrilege, and was only released by the separation of his hand from his body. It has remained ever since fastened to the image. The robber turned hermit, and led ever after an exemplary life, but yet the saint's decree was performed, and tradition says that he continues to haunt this sepulchre, and implore St. Clare's pardon with groans and lamentations. Now I think of it, those which we have just heard may very possibly have been uttered by the ghost of this sinner, but of this I will not be positive. All that I can say is, that since that time no one has ever dared to touch the statue. Then do not be foolhardy, good Sedner, for the love of heaven. Give up your design, nor expose yourself unnecessarily to certain destruction. Not being convinced that his destruction would be so certain as Helena seemed to think it, Lorenzo persisted in his resolution. The nuns besought him to desist in piteous terms, and evening pointed out the robber's hand, which in effect was still visible upon the arm of the statue. This proof, as they imagined, must convince him. It was very far from doing so, and they were greatly scandalized when he declared his suspicion that the dried and shriveled fingers had been placed there by order of the prioress. In spite of their prayers and threats he approached the statue. He sprang over the iron rails, which defended it, and the saint underwent a thorough examination. The image at first appeared to be of stone, but proved on further inspection to be formed of no more solid materials than colored wood. He shook it and attempted to move it, but it appeared to be of a piece with the base, which it stood upon. He examined it over and over. Still no clue guided him to the solution of this mystery, for which the nuns were become equally solicitous. When they saw that he touched the statue with impunity, he paused and listened. The groans were repeated at intervals, and he was convinced of being in the spot nearest to them. He mused upon this singular event, and ran over the statue with inquiring eyes. Suddenly they rested upon the shriveled hand. It struck him that so particular an injunction was not given without cause, not to touch the arm of the image. He again ascended the pedestal. He examined the object of his attention, and discovered a small knob of iron concealed between the saint's shoulder and what was supposed to have been the hand of the robber. This observation delighted him. He applied his fingers to the knob and pressed it down forcibly. Immediately a rumbling noise was heard within the statue, as if a chain tightly stretched was flying back. Startled at the sound, the timid nuns started away, prepared to hasten from the vault at the first appearance of danger. All remaining quiet and still, they again gathered round Lorenzo, and beheld his proceedings with anxious curiosity. Finding that nothing followed this discovery, he descended. As he took his hand from the saint, she trembled beneath his touch. This created new terrors in the spectators, who believed the statue to be animated. Lorenzo's ideas upon the subject were widely different. He easily comprehended that the noise which he had heard was occasioned by his having loosened a chain which attached the image to its pedestal. He once more attempted to move it, and succeeded without much exertion. He placed it upon the ground, and then perceived the pedestal to be hollow, and covered at the opening with an heavy iron grate. This excited such general curiosity that the sisters forgot both their real and imaginary dangers. Lorenzo proceeded to raise the grate, in which the nuns assisted him to the utmost of their strength. The attempt was accomplished with little difficulty. A deep abyss now presented itself before them, whose thick obscurity the eye strove in vain to pierce. The rays of the lamp were too feeble to be of much assistance. Nothing was discernible save a flight of rough unshapen steps, which sank into the yawning gulf, and were soon lost in darkness. The groans were heard no more, but all believed them to have ascended from this cavern. As he bent over it, Lorenzo fancied that he distinguished something bright twinkling through the gloom. He gazed attentively upon the spot where it showed itself, and was convinced that he saw a small spark of light, now visible, now disappearing. He communicated this circumstance to the nuns. They also perceived the spark, but, when he declared his intention to descend into the cave, they united to oppose his resolution. All their remonstrances could not prevail on him to alter it. None of them had courage enough to accompany him, neither could he think of depriving them of the lamp. Alone, therefore, and in darkness, he prepared to pursue his design, while the nuns were contented to offer up prayers for his success and safety. The steps were so narrow and uneven that to descend them was like walking down the side of a precipice. The obscurity by which he was surrounded rendered his footing insecure. He was obliged to proceed with great caution, lest he should miss the steps and fall into the gulf below him. This he was several times on the point of doing. However, he arrived sooner upon solid ground than he had expected. He now found that the thick darkness and impenetrable mists which reigned through the cavern had deceived him into the belief of its being much more profound than it proved upon inspection. He reached the foot of the stairs unhurt. He now stopped, and looked round for the spark, which had before caught his attention. He sought it in vain. All was dark and gloomy. He listened for the groans, but his ear caught no sound except the distant murmur of the nuns above, as in low voices they repeated their Ave Marias. He stood irresolute to which side he should address his steps. At all events he determined to proceed. He did so, but slowly, fearing lest instead of approaching he should be retiring from the object of his search. The groans seemed to announce one in pain, or at least in sorrow, and he hoped to have the power of relieving the mourner's calamities. A plaintive tone, sounding at no great distance, at length reached his hearing. He bent his course joyfully towards it. It became more audible as he advanced, and he soon beheld again the spark of light, which a low projecting wall had hitherto concealed from him. It proceeded from a small lamp which was placed upon an heap of stones, and whose faint and melancholy rays served rather to point out than dispel the horrors of a narrow, gloomy dungeon formed in one side of the cavern. It also showed several other recesses of similar construction, but whose depth was buried in obscurity. Coldly played the light upon the damp walls, whose dew-stained surface gave back a feeble reflection. A thick and pestilential fog clouded the height of the vaulted dungeon. As Lorenzo advanced, he felt a piercing chillness spread itself through his veins. The frequent groans still engaged him to move forwards. He turned towards them, and by the lamp's glimmering beams beheld in a corner of this loathsome abode a creature stretched upon a bed of straw, so wretched, so emaciated, so pale, that he doubted to think her woman. She was half naked, her long disheveled hair fell in disorder over her face, and almost entirely concealed it. One wasted arm hung listlessly upon a tattered rug, which covered her convulsed and shivering limbs. The other was wrapped round a small bundle, and held it closely to her bosom. A large rosary lay near her. Opposite to her was a crucifix, on which she bent her sunk eyes fixedly, and by her side stood a basket and a small earthen pitcher. Lorenzo stopped. He was petrified with horror. He gazed upon the miserable object with disgust and pity. He trembled at the spectacle. He grew sick at heart. His strength failed him, and his limbs were unable to support his weight. He was obliged to lean against the low wall which was near him, unable to go forward or to address the sufferer. She cast her eyes towards the staircase. The wall concealed Lorenzo, and she observed him not. "No one comes," she at length murmured. As she spoke, her voice was hollow and rattled in her throat. She sighed bitterly. "No one comes," she repeated. "No, they have forgotten me. They will come no more." She paused for a moment, then continued mournfully. 2 days, 2 long, long days, and yet no food, and yet no hope, no comfort. Foolish woman, how can I wish to lengthen a life so wretched, yet such a death? Oh, God, to perish by such a death, to linger out such ages in torture. Till now, I knew not what it was to hunger. Hark! No, no one comes. They will come no more." She was silent. She shivered and drew the rug over her naked shoulders. "I am very cold. I am still unused to the damps of this dungeon. It is strange, but no matter. Colder shall I soon be, and yet not feel it. I shall be cold, cold as you are." She looked at the bundle which lay upon her breast. She bent over it and kissed it, then drew back hastily and shuddered with disgust. It was once so sweet. It would have been so lovely, so like him. I have lost it forever. How a few days have changed it. I should not know it again myself. Yet it is dear to me. God, how dear! I will forget what it is. I will only remember what it was and love it as well as when it was so sweet, so lovely, so like him. I thought that I had wept away all my tears, but here is one still lingering." She wiped her eyes with a tress of her hair. She put out her hand for the pitcher and reached it with difficulty. She cast into it a look of hopeless inquiry. She sighed and replaced it upon the ground. "Quite a void. Not a drop, not one drop left to cool my scorched-up, burning palate. Now would I give treasures for a draught of water. And they are God's servants, who make me suffer thus. They think themselves holy, while they torture me like fiends. They are cruel and unfeeling, and it is they who bid me repent, and it is they who threaten me with eternal perdition. Savior, Savior, you think not so." She again fixed her eyes upon the crucifix, took her rosary, and while she told her beads, the quick motion of her lips declared her to be praying with fervency. While he listened to her melancholy accents, Lorenzo's sensibility became yet more violently affected. The first sight of such misery had given a sensible shock to his feelings, but, That being passed, he now advanced towards the captive. She heard his steps, and uttering a cry of joy, dropped the rosary. "Hark! Hark! Hark!" she cried. "Someone comes." She strove to raise herself, but her strength was unequal to the attempt. She fell back, and as she sank again upon the bed of straw, Lorenzo heard the rattling of heavy chains. He still approached, while the prisoner thus continued. "Is it you, Camilla? You are come then at last? Oh, it was time. I thought that you had forsaken me, that I was doomed to perish of hunger. Give me to drink, Camilla, for pity's sake. I am faint with long fasting, and grown so weak that I cannot raise myself from the ground. Good Camilla, give me to drink, lest I expire before you." Fearing that surprise in her enfeebled state may be fatal, Lorenzo was at a loss how to address her. "It is not Camilla," said he at length, speaking in a slow and gentle voice. "Who is it then?" replied the sufferer. "Alex, perhaps, or Violante. My eyes are grown so dim and feeble that I cannot distinguish your features. But whichever it is, if your breast is sensible of the least compassion, if you are not more cruel than wolves and tigers, take pity on my sufferings. You know that I am dying for want of sustenance. This is the third day since these lips have received nourishment. Do you bring me food? Or come you only to announce my death, and learn how long I have yet to exist in agony?" "You mistake my business," replied Lorenzo. "I am no emissary of the cruel prioress. I pity your sorrows, and come here to relieve them." "To relieve them," repeated the captive. "Said you, to relieve them?" At the same time starting from the ground, and supporting herself upon her hands, she gazed upon the stranger earnestly. "Great God! It is no illusion. A man! Speak! Who are you? What brings you here? Come you to save me, to restore me to liberty, to life and light? Oh, speak! Speak quickly, lest I encourage and hope whose disappointment will destroy me." "Be calm," replied Lorenzo in a voice soothing and compassionate. "The domina of whose cruelty you complain has already paid the forfeit of her offenses. You have nothing more to fear from her. A few minutes will restore you to liberty and the embraces of your friends from whom you have been secluded. You may rely upon my protection. Give me your hand, and be not fearful. Let me conduct you where you may receive those attentions which your feeble state requires." "Oh, yes, yes, yes," cried the prisoner with an exulting shriek. "There is a God then, and a just one. Joy, joy! I shall once more breathe the fresh air, and view the light of the glorious sunbeams. I will go with you, stranger, I will go with you. Oh, heaven will bless you for pitying an unfortunate, but this too must go with me," she added, pointing to the small bundle, which she still clasped to her bosom. "I cannot part with this. I will bear it away. It shall convince the world how dreadful are the abodes so falsely termed religious. Good stranger, lend me your hand to rise. I am faint with want, and sorrow, and sickness, and my forces have quite forsaken me." "So, that is well." As Lorenzo stooped to raise her, the beams of the lamp struck full upon his face. "Almighty God!" she exclaimed. "Is it possible? That look, those features! Oh, yes, it is, it is." She extended her arms to throw them round him, but her enfeebled frame was unable to sustain the emotions which agitated her bosom. She fainted, and again sank upon the bed of straw. Lorenzo was surprised at her last exclamation. He thought that he had before heard such accents as her hollow voice had just formed, but where he could not remember, he saw that in her dangerous situation immediate physical aid was absolutely necessary, and he hastened to convey her from the dungeon. He was at first prevented from doing so by a strong chain fastened round the prisoner's body, and fixing her to the neighboring wall. However, his natural strength being aided by anxiety to relieve the unfortunate, he soon forced out the staple to which one end of the chain was attached. Then, taking the captive in his arms, he bent his course towards the staircase. The rays of the lamp above, as well as the murmur of female voices, guided his steps. He gained the stairs, and in a few minutes after arrived at the iron grate. The nuns during his absence had been terribly tormented by curiosity and apprehension. They were equally surprised and delighted on seeing him suddenly emerge from the cave. Every heart was filled with compassion for the miserable creature whom he bore in his arms. While the nuns, and Virginia in particular, employed themselves in striving to recall her to her senses, Lorenzo related in few words the manner of his finding her. He then observed to them that by this time the tumult must have been quelled, and that he could now conduct them to their friends without danger. All were eager to quit the sepulchre. Still, to prevent all possibility of ill usage, they besought Lorenzo to venture out first alone and examine whether the coast was clear. With this request he complied. Helena offered to conduct him to the staircase, and they were on the point of departing, when a strong light flashed from several passages upon the adjacent walls. At the same time steps were heard of people approaching hastily, and whose numbers seemed to be considerable. The nuns were greatly alarmed at this circumstance. They supposed their retreat to be discovered and the rioters to be advancing in pursuit of them. Hastily quitting the prisoner who remained insensible, they crowded round Lorenzo and claimed his promise to protect them. Virginia alone forgot her own danger by striving to relieve the sorrows of another. She supported the sufferer's head upon her knees, bathing her temples with rose water, chafing her cold hands, and sprinkling her face with tears which were drawn from her by compassion. The strangers approaching nearer, Lorenzo was enabled to dispel the fears of the suppliants. His name, pronounced by a number of voices among which he distinguished the duke's, pealed along the vaults and convinced him that he was the object of their search. He communicated this intelligence to the nuns, who received it with rapture. A few moments after confirmed his idea. Don Ramirez as well as the Duke appeared, followed by attendants with torches. They had been seeking him through the vaults, in order to let him know that the mob was dispersed and the riot entirely over. Lorenzo recounted briefly his adventure in the cavern, and explained how much the unknown was in want of medical assistance. He besought the Duke to take charge of her, as well as of the nuns and pensioners. "As for me," said he, "other cares demand my attention. While you with one half of the archers convey these ladies to their respective homes, I wish the other half to be left with me. I will examine the cavern below and pervade the most secret recesses of the sepulchre. I cannot rest till convinced that over their wretched victim was the only one confined by superstition in these vaults." The Duke applauded his intention. Don Ramirez offered to assist him in his inquiry, and his proposal was accepted with gratitude. The nuns, having made their acknowledgments to Lorenzo, committed themselves to the care of his uncle, and were conducted from the sepulchre. Virginia requested that the unknown may be given to her in charge, and promised to let Lorenzo know whenever she was sufficiently recovered to accept his visits. In truth, she made this promise more from consideration for herself than for either Lorenzo or the captive. She had witnessed his politeness, gentleness, and intrepidity with sensible emotion. She wished earnestly to preserve his acquaintance, and in addition to the sentiments of pity which the prisoner excited, she hoped that her attention to this unfortunate would raise her a degree in the esteem of Lorenzo. She had no occasion to trouble herself upon this head. The kindness already displayed by her and the tender concern which she had shown for the sufferer had gained her an exalted place in his good graces. While occupied in alleviating the captive's sorrows, the nature of her employment adorned her with new charms, and rendered her beauty 1,000 times more interesting. Lorenzo viewed her with admiration and delight. He considered her as a ministering angel descended to the aid of afflicted innocence, nor could his heart have resisted her attractions, had it not been steeled by the remembrance of Antonia. The Duke now conveyed the nuns in safety to the dwellings of their respective friends. The rescued prisoner was still insensible, and gave no signs of life except by occasional groans. She was borne upon a sort of litter. Virginia, who was constantly by the side of it, was apprehensive that, exhausted by long abstinence and shaken by the sudden change from bonds and darkness to liberty and light, her frame would never get the better of the shock. Lorenzo and Don Ramirez still remained in the sepulchre. After deliberating upon their proceedings, it was resolved that to prevent losing time, the archers should be divided into two bodies, that with one Don Ramirez should examine the cavern, while Lorenzo with the other may penetrate into the further vaults. This being arranged, and his followers being provided with torches, Don Ramirez advanced to the cavern. He had already descended some steps, when he heard people approaching hastily from the interior part of the sepulchre. This surprised him, and he quitted the cave precipitately. "Do you hear footsteps?" said Lorenzo. "Let us bend our course towards them. It is from this side that they seem to proceed." At that moment a loud and piercing shriek induced him to quicken his steps. "Help! Help! For God's sake!" cried a voice, whose melodious tone penetrated Lorenzo's heart with terror.